Hello again and welcome back once again for the 22nd time to the very first episode of Princess Mallie's Dumb Internet Show. I'm Miguel Mal and this is the show. Today's episode is a doozy because this is the -1 video, and I do mean the. And it's also essentially the Godzilla video, at least for me. What do I mean by this? Well, today's episode is going to be long as hell, which you can already tell, and incredibly intense. Like, really, I'm not kidding. Not only are we going to be diving into all of the thematic content of the newest Godzilla movie, which is a lot, but it's also going to get super personal because since the subject matter kind of calls for it, and it's part of my main thesis here, we're finally going to talk about why Godzilla is so important to me. And I'm not talking about fan or whatever. If you know me, you know that doesn't cover it. Godzilla is way more important to me than just an IP or a series of movies. So it's going to be heavy, which is why before I get into it, there's a couple things that I need to get through. Organizing this by order of importance, first thing to know is that this final draft script is 22,758 words, give or take some potential edits I make as I record it. I fully expect it to be longer than 2 hours, and I want it out before the new Hollywood movie, which is in a week from me writing this. Because of that, don't expect too much real editing or visual aids for the main portion of the video because I don't have the time for it. Instead, treat this as more of a podcast, kind of like that first video I made on -1 back on my birthday like 2 years ago. So don't expect any cool H. Bomberman style stuff. Just have it on in the background while you're doing your taxes or something. That out of the way, because of the nature of this video, I'm going to do something unprecedented. Now, don't expect this to become the norm or even relatively common, but at least just for this time, if you really want to just not deal with any of the heavy stuff we're going to be talking about, if that kind of subject matter discussion isn't for you, then I'm going to give you permission to skip to secret segment, just this one time. And you can use this princess point here to redeem it. However, if you don't use it here, you do not get to cash it in on some other video, okay? You gotta promise to follow the rules and only skip to secret segment for this video, alright? We're civilized people. We don't just skip to secret segment all willy-nilly. This is a special case. Least important thing here is answering some dumb questions that you probably don't care about. And at this point, you can safely skip to, like, the trigger warnings and get on with it if you really want to. But like, if you're super curious, to hear about my channel, anyone gives a shit about that. Namely, what happened to that continuity video, and it's late March. Why did it take me this long to make a video about a movie that came out in early November? That kind of thing. A big part of that is simply that this script is not only super long, but also, as I've said, pretty heavy stuff. So it took a while to actually work through it all. Regarding the bigger picture of why it takes me so long to seemingly make anything, well, that's a slightly larger problem. It would be easy for me to hand-wave it as personal stuff or whatever and just leave it at that level where it's none of your business. But this is the video where I basically pour my heart out about Godzilla, so I might as well be real with you. I've had the continuity video half finished for like 6 months now. Seriously, I mean, it's like halfway edited. Something I recently learned about, which was really enlightening to me because of its explanatory power, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've got your basic psychological needs at the bottom, then safety and stability, and then love and community, and then finally like personal goals and self-actualization and that sort of thing. I'm underneath the pyramid here. I struggle with food and I don't know what I'm going to be eating next week. Stability is not only something that I don't have, it's something I currently have no means to even begin to attempt to reach, which, as you can imagine, throws my ability to maintain anything above that completely out of whack. This video is, for me, way up at the top. It's something I want to do for me because I want to do it. Yeah, believe it or don't, I don't make YouTube videos for fame or notoriety. I make them because I just like talking about monster movies and stuff. It doesn't really matter to me that they aren't popular or anything. This is a creative outlet for my ideas without a clear audience in mind. All of this is very much in the old school YouTube tradition of broadcast yourself. I'm not trying to appease any algorithms, I mean, obviously, or I wouldn't be making a 20,000 word video essay about the heaviest topics ever for a channel that up until now was just goofy, nerdy stuff. I have, however, done some legwork in setting up a Patreon and a Ko-fi. I'm going to call it Coffee because I think that's how I hear it pronounced. Now, the Patreon page isn't live because I don't fully feel comfortable with it yet because it's only about monthly donations, which does incentivize consistent output, sure, but it also carries the expectation of it, which, for reasons I've just explained, I don't feel I can match. Now, the Coffee page is up, however, and there's no obligation there to chunk consistent support behind me for any reason, so that I'm cool with. I'm going to link to it in the description in case you care. Full disclosure, though, if you send anything through that link, it doesn't mean all of a suddenly the second Godzilla continuity video is coming out promptly on 420 or anything like that. I'm going to use that for food, right? The pyramid? I should also mention that I feel kind of gross even talking about this at all. Part of the reason things are so awful is because I'm a fucking terrible capitalist. I just plain never figured out how to make the system work for me, and I have a fundamental ideological, psychological predisposition to make all of the wrong choices when it comes to money. Monetization is always the last thing on my mind. I have no idea how to market myself, and the very notion of even having to do that strikes me as gross and fucked up. From my perspective, the only people I want consuming anything I make are people who will enjoy it. The idea of forcing it in front of people who wouldn't be into it and or like tying consumption of it to money, just ew. That's so ew. Like, conceptually, that sounds repulsive to me. So, like, of course, I don't know how to do it. Maybe if things were different and I was a greedy, power-hungry, capitalist pig dog, things would be different, but I'm not. I'm just a weirdo that likes Godzilla movies a little too much. Either way, I will say that if you do contribute, I'll definitely give some sort of shout out or something next time I put something out. There aren't really like tiered bespoke rewards for Coffee because, you know, like there are for Patreon, but I will still make an effort if you do. That just seems fair to me. Anyways, with that out of the way, we've come to our main event, for which I'm going to have to issue some trigger warnings. Now, I've never done one of these before, and I can't account for everything, so I don't really know for sure what all I need to disclose. However, if the movie, being of course Godzilla -1, covers it, then I'm going to cover it. This includes the bomb, the war, a bevy of mental health topics like trauma, survivor's guilt, and probably the biggest one, suicidal ideation. I also cover the symptom of derealization or depersonalization or whatever you want to call it. And as I said, it gets personal in sections, so listening to if listening to a trans woman with PTSD talk about suicide from both an in-universe and real-world perspective is going to be something you can't do, then just skip the secret segment and don't do it. I really hope that covers all my bases, but again, I can't account for every single possible trigger without knowing every possible trigger, so I'm going to have to ask that you use your best judgment here based on the stated subject matter on whether or not this video is for you. That said, there is no preamble left, and it's finally time to get into the -1 video. The first Godzilla gap that I lived through was the one between Godzilla vs. Destoroyah in 1995 and Godzilla 2000 in 1999. A break of 4 years and 2 days. Full disclosure, I didn't end up seeing Destroya until around 1997 via a gray market subtitled version that I rented from a video store in Austin. Godzilla 2000, of course, was theatrically released in the US in August of 2000, making the actual amount of time I waited between viewing each a little shorter. Of course, at the time, between the newly accessible internet and fanzines like GFan, I was well aware of what was happening, so I felt the whole length of that gap. It just took me a little longer to see the actual films in question because they, had to get to me first. But it's a little more complicated than that because of Zilla, which was the first of the 3 stepping stones on the loss of my innocence, and was, ironically, the hardest one for me to come to grips with. I thought, between 1994 and 1998, that I was going to get an actual Godzilla movie, and at the time I had no reason to think otherwise. I didn't know. I didn't know what Hollywood really was or how it worked. I didn't really understand capitalism as a concept. Still don't, really. And I was, naive and gullible. I was a child. I was 10 years old when Deanzilla came out, and I still watched Godzilla movies because I wanted my monster fights. I wanted my monster fights so bad that I couldn't yet articulate what was so special about the original film in '84, because there were no monster fights to distract me. This is all true. I promise you that I'm being sincere when I tell you that going into the theater on opening day, as we sat down in the seats on May 19th, I whispered to my mom, "Remember, the Godzilla in this one is Junior." And I believed it, too. Who knows if my mom kept up with enough of my Godzilla ramblings to understand what that meant, but it meant something to me. When I left the theater, I was just confused. I didn't understand how to process what I had just seen and why it was the way it was. Someone who loves Godzilla as much as I do, surely, you must think. Having been so young when Deanzilla premiered, my initial reaction would be outrage and sadness. But no, actually, I just felt confused, which eventually became denial and then bargaining. I bought the toys. I had a picture book about the baby Zillas. I even went back and I saw it a second time. And I had to see it twice to realize what had actually happened. And then I got angry. So angry, in fact, that I stopped paying attention to the fan websites and the zines in their entirety for about 2 years. And it wasn't until I went on a trip back to Austin and took the opportunity to visit a hobby/import shop and saw a toy of the new Godzilla that I even learned that there was a new Godzilla movie at all. I'm telling this story because that experience, that childhood roller coaster of emotions and the interminable waiting, that loss of innocence at the realization that capitalism isn't your friend and that the Hollywood movies are nothing more than products that set the tone going forward for what it's like living through a time with no new Godzilla. This was also the case with the 12-year gap between Final Wars and Shin Godzilla. That second long period of my life without a Godzilla was a time of incredible change and difficulty for me. And when we finally did get a new one, other things started falling into place. I've said before that me and Godzilla share a kind of metaphorical heartbeat, which is basically a poetic way of turning an enormous string of coincidences into a mythologized narrative of my life. But when you're telling a story, it's always better to go with the legend. Real history is for when you want to understand the facts, how things ended up the way that they did. But when you're telling a story, you're allowed to blur the lines a little bit. Now, originally here, I put down a couple of pens, like it was a Jenny Nicholson video, and I stated that they weren't just there to be picked up later to neatly wrap up an idea, but also overarching themes to keep in mind as we go forward. But also, I did intend to use them to set up a conclusion. Because of the long gap that occurred between the 3 chunks that I wrote this in, that kind of got lost somewhere in the mix, and so now I want to reiterate those ideas more in line with the latter rather than the former. So in that sense, don't think of these as pens anymore and expect to pay off, but do still think of them. The first is the fact that Zilla, the movie, was ever allowed to happen in the first place, and the second was that shared heartbeat between me and Godzilla that I mentioned. You may not have realized it, but we've just lived through a gap longer than the one between the Versus series and the Millennium series. Just 2 weeks short of 5 years. You probably didn't notice it because Hollywood is still trying to make Godzilla movies, but their attempts now have been getting progressively less insulting and more in the vein of something like The Room or Manos, The Hands of Fate, so hilariously inept that they wrap back around into being entertaining again. Godzilla vs. Kong was far and away the best comedy film of 2021, and here's where we need to modify the pens. But remember, in this draft, they're not pens per se anymore. But basically, we need to take that first idea about Geno 1 and split it into 2 daughter ideas. The first being that Hollywood effectively hid the fact that we just lived through a 5-year-long gap at all, and the second being that Hollywood not only never has understood Godzilla, but seems completely incapable of ever understanding Godzilla. Notice also that this implies that Godzilla is something that can even be understood at all, which is another one of those core ideas behind the whole video. Now there's also Singular Point and the various shorts that we've gotten, and Toho has gone absolutely nuts actually attempting to, for the first time in my life, treat the Godzilla IP like it's profitable and actually sell it in a dizzying array of promotional merchandise and tie-ins and mobile games and crossover things and all of that junk. Godzilla is everywhere now, and not a year has gone by since Planet Eater that there hasn't been some sort of Godzilla thing to look forward to or geek out about. More than that, since 2014, it's been an annual tradition for me to watch every Godzilla movie in a row over the course of 8 days, which has the ironic name of Deathiversary despite the fact that neither of us actually died. But there is still a gap, and for the past 5 Deathiversaries I've had this same lineup of 32 films, which neatly divide into 4 a day, and although I like to introduce a gimmick every year now, the fact is I've spent 5 years with the same set of 32, and in a time when Godzilla feels so alive, it's been starting to stick out. What's more, my life changed completely. Every semblance of safety I had crumbled, and the people I trusted most literally threw me out on the street. And I know that Western fans like to be pretty fast and loose and call the last 4 films the Reiwa series, and I even know that Toho sometimes themselves calls them that in English publicity materials. But, not a single one of them ever actually premiered during the Reiwa era. The fact that you only ever hear this in English media makes it pretty transparent. It's a term of convenience and laziness, frankly. This movie, -1, this is the actual first Reiwa-era Godzilla film, and it carries the burden of setting the tone for the future of the series and the same way that Biollante and the original film did before it. Godzilla -1 isn't the 5th false Reiwa-era Godzilla film. It's the first real Reiwa-era Godzilla film. The 2010 series has ended, followed by a 5-year gap, and a brand new series, the Reiwa series, begins now. The bulk of this essay is going to be looking at how -1 sets the tone and tries to define what a Reiwa-era Godzilla movie is, and why it's different from the Godzilla movies of the Showa and Heisei eras. To be clear here, in case there are people watching this who don't actually know, Showa and Heisei aren't nonsense words made up by toku nerds to classify things under. They are Japanese ningo, which is a traditional thing that goes back hundreds of years, although the current way that they handle it has only been in practice since Emperor Meiji in the 1860s. The short version is, think of it like reading an ancient historical document that reads, in the 10th year of King Blargenfargen, or something like that, right? It's basically Japan's version of that, and they've kept it going all of this time as part of their cultural traditions that come packaged with the constitutional monarchy. So the Showa era starts at Showa 1 on December 25th of 1926 and ends in Showa 64 on January 7th, 1989. The Heisei era picks up after that on January 8th and lasts until April 30th of 2019. The current Reiwa era begins on May 1st of 2019. Ningo follow the Gregorian calendar, or at least they have in modern times. So the year Showa 1 was actually only 6 days long, and Showa 64 was only a week. The current Ningo year is Reiwa 6, and it was Reiwa 5 when -1 came out and when I first started writing this. I do not use these names to refer to things that they don't refer to. So when I say, for example, a Heisei era Godzilla movie, I'm talking about every Godzilla movie from Biollante to Planet Eater. Not just the Versus series, and excluding Return because that's a film from Showa 59. And although it anticipates Biollante in some ways, Biollante is very much the first true Heisei Godzilla film in every meaningful way. It set the precedent that every subsequent film followed, consciously or not. When I'm talking about the series, starting from the continuity reboot of Return up until the breaking continuity after Destroya, that's called the Versus series. The films from the 2010s are called, well, the 2010 series. It's not the most creative name, but it's definitely accurate. So, I don't really like reviews. I never have. The concept makes me feel gross, which is a thing that's carried over from when I was a teenager, and I found the idea of people trying to tell you their bad opinions instead of you just having your own to be disgusting and stupid. The only person who can tell you what you really think about this or any Godzilla movie or anything at all is yourself. YouTube and the rise of video essays have swayed me on that a little bit, but only in the sense that what I find interesting is not stuff like, oh, I like this movie, go see it, 10 out of 10. What does it for me is hearing people dissect art and share their interpretations and use those things to springboard off into other things that they're passionate about. This is not a video where you're going to hear me decide whether or not you should go see Godzilla -1. Obviously, I think everyone should see every Godzilla movie, no exceptions. The expected audience for this video is people who were already going to see the movie Anoios or who already have. Instead, this is a video about two things. One, Godzilla in general, and two, me in particular. By the end of this video, I don't just want you to be able to appreciate -1 as a Godzilla film. I don't want you to just be able to appreciate it as a film or a piece of art, period, but I want to, as best as I can, communicate in some way exactly why Godzilla is so important to me and why it's more than an IP or a bunch of movies or a fandom. And I don't expect you to share those feelings, but at the very least, I want you to have some idea of why Godzilla is important. Now, I know I just said that this Godzilla movie is supposed to set the tone for the Reiwa era, but Godzilla does not exist in a vacuum, and Takashi Yamazaki is intimately familiar with the source material, and although there are a lot of new ideas and so much of the execution is quite novel, the core of what makes a movie a Godzilla movie, as it were, is completely intact. The way I describe the Hollywood movie Godzilla King of the Monsters to people is that it's a lot like one of those guys who's like an edgy 2000s comedian tell you they aren't racist because they have a Japanese friend. It feels like most of the movie is made up of bits lifted from actual Godzilla movies, but with the context completely misunderstood. It's an homage, but it's all hollow. It doesn't say anything at best, and at worst it completely inverts the original intention of the scenes that they stole. Probably the biggest example of this is that they have the only Japanese character in the entire movie feed a nuclear weapon to Godzilla to heal him so he can go save the day. A concept directly lifted from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, but without any understanding of why the idea works so well in that movie, but comes off as blasphemous in the Hollywood version. Godzilla Minus One is the exact opposite of that. A lot of the film is made up of pieces of previous Godzilla films, but in this case their usage here not only mirrors the context from their original source, but it gives them new meaning from the recontextualization. Generally, the skeleton of the film is kind of a rehash of Planet Eater, as is the focus on mental health as the primary theme. So going from 32 to 33, on the surface, Minus One feels very much like a straightforward continuation, picking up exactly where the series left off. But rather than taking place in the far future, where humans have already lost, Minus puts us right in the thick of the turning point of human civilization. Planet Eater's point of no return is this movie's present, its lived reality. Putting us closer to contemporary times also gives us a setting more like those of the previous Godzilla films, so we're again dealing with war and the bomb and the other ills of civilization in the same way Godzilla has for most of their history. So, while the film is still centrally focused on characters who already think of the end of the world as a past event, it has more free rein to do things that weren't tenable in the pure sci-fi setting of the last three films. The other primary influences on the film which are self-evident are the original 1954 film and GMK, with GMK being the one that Takashi Yamazaki himself has consistently cited in interviews as both his primary influence and his favorite Godzilla movie. Just a sidebar here, but the fact that the presumed showrunner, as it were, favorite Godzilla movie is the anti-fascist one, as a trans person living in the US obsessed with a Japanese monster, this just makes me so happy to hear. I mean, he's wrong. Biollante is objectively mankind's greatest work, but just to have the current steward of Godzilla's voice openly appreciate the one that's a vicious teardown of Japan's equivalent to Holocaust deniers is just special. Anyway, while there are plenty of scenes from the 54 film, GMK, and Planet Eater grafted into Yamazaki's Godzilla so boldly and so obvious that I don't really think it's worth it to point them out, there are a few moments cherry-picked from a couple of others that I do want to call attention to. The most obvious of these is certainly the Godzillasaurus attack scene from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, replicated here with a lack of properly armed soldiers and a larger and far more violent Godzillasaurus. The scene is interesting here because we're essentially following Koichi Ueda's character from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the veteran Masukichi Ikehata. And the original film, we view Terasawa as digging up documents and following the trail of a buried military secret from the war. And the fact that what seems to be a conspiracy-minded old man is actually telling the truth is surprising because it leads down the rabbit hole of the mystery. In Minus, we're seeing the parts that the previous film skipped over, the actual effect of witnessing something you can't explain and can't even report. Emi, Miki, and Terasawa are there on a mission. They're observers, but Minus uses the experience to prop up its themes about trauma. Spoiler alert, this angle is the major defining feature that makes Minus One a Reiwa-era Godzilla film instead of a Heisei-era one. More nuanced is Shikishima putting the picture of Noriko up on his instrument panel in the Shinden plane. This is a callback to Godzilla Raids Again, a quickie sequel that treads the waters of the original film and was pushed out the door in 6 months by a substitute director when it really needed another draft. In that film, Kobayashi's sacrifice is a pale imitation of Serizawa's in the previous film, and the emotional impact is stepped on by the ruinous pacing. Here, it serves as a wink to the audience. Yamazaki utilizes the lifted scene here not as fan service, but as an added bit of what I want to call fan horror. We already know what Shikishima intends to do, that's the plot, but Yamazaki uses the photo to tell us, the audience of Godzilla nerds, that he means business. Shikishima is going to pull a Kobayashi, as it were. This becomes extra valuable as an homage when it's subverted later. The final bit that I want to talk about is Godzilla's death. Now, I read the spoilers. I knew Godzilla was going to die. I never expected him to survive this movie in the first place. What I wasn't prepared for was the fact that his death was going to be portrayed the way that it was. I go on at length about this in a later section, but Godzilla's portrayal in this film is unique. Godzilla has been portrayed as an outright menace before, plenty of times, but that sense of dread is almost always funneled into one of the stock themes of the series, like war and the bomb and the Cold War and all of that kind of stuff. People have always felt at least a little sympathetic for Godzilla. We usually see Godzilla as an anti-villain, even when he's really just the straight-up villain, because Godzilla movies want you to see things that way. They want you to know that any world where Godzilla exists doesn't deserve to live without him. That humanity and civilization are the annoying asshole character in a slasher movie that you wish would be killed off first, but they make you wait until the climax to pay it off. And then, of course, the payoff is the graphically illustrated horrors of war. Hell, GMK makes you positively root for the bastard, as that movie's Godzilla is the personification of the victims of Imperial Japan. Godzilla movies take their ideas about why humans are awful, and they dress them up in the form of monsters, and they have those monsters repay those sentiments in kind. When Godzilla is the one wearing the costume, we're looking for catharsis, and when it's a space monster, we're looking for a simple feel-good filler story. For -1, Godzilla is wearing the costume of the horrors of war, and a film where the primary theme is how war destroys lives. Remember, in this film, the Godzillasaurus scene isn't just a clue to a mystery, it's a tragic loss of life visited on unwell military personnel at the end of a war that they didn't want to be in, that the government actively covered up with a conspiracy. Unlike Shen, Godzilla is no mere victim this time. He's a part of it. He is the war. And yet, Godzilla's death here isn't a triumphant explosion like Phileas at the end of Planet of the Monsters or Yamazaki's beloved GMK. Instead, he opts here to have Godzilla's death sequence strongly mirror his meltdown from Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. In a film that's already impossible to watch without crying, he takes the one moment even the monster fight bros can't deal with and uses that as the template for how he depicts the death of a monster that is the personification of the horrors of war. This is a choice. Yamazaki knows Godzilla very well, and you don't know Godzilla that well and make Godzilla's death intentionally resemble the meltdown from Destoroyah without a purpose. He spent the last 2 hours making you see Godzilla as something to be feared and hated, an enemy combatant that is coming to destroy you specifically and your family. And at the very end, he forces the audience to look at this monster as just another in the endless list of lives claimed by the war. And everyone, even the kid, can't help but salute the guy. Shin Godzilla made Godzilla a victim of human negligence, but Minus makes him a victim of circumstance. A civilian with the war happening all over the island chains the migratory species calls home, caught up in something he didn't really understand. Godzilla is terrifying, and he has killed both military and civilians. But in the middle of the Pacific War, how many soldiers could say that they haven't done the exact same thing? For a lot of non-veterans, especially in the US and Japan, the simple and ambiguous phrase, the war, usually means World War II when not taken with any qualifiers or previous context. The obvious exceptions to this, of course, are places that are currently in the middle of wars, like Ukraine or the situation with Israel and Palestine. We're talking about war in the past tense as a luxury that they don't have. Of course, Japan hasn't been in a war since, but even after the United States wars in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East, all of which have left a huge impact on the collective consciousness, we still tend to see World War II as the war. It is, for the entire postmodern world, the real-life version of the Great Backstory War. It's responsible for putting the post in postmodern in the first place. Postmodern is synonymous with post-war. The entire history of the human race can be neatly divided into two distinct parts: everything before the war and everything after. And that's not just my mythologizing either. That's science. For some time now, the Anthropocene Working Group has been leaning towards starting the Anthropocene epoch at present, which is, when a hard number is needed, rounded to 1950 to coincide with the period when radiometric dating first began to be used. Part of this decision is based on the increasing abundance of radioactive materials past this time in the layers, and as the ICS is specifically concerned with looking for globally correlating markers, this and other types of pollution observable in recent sedimentary layers are going to be the smoking gun if the ICS ever pulls the trigger. Earlier this year, which is last year at this point, a site was proposed for the Golden Spike, being Crawford Lake in Ontario, which would make the first stage of the Anthropocene epoch presumably called the Crawfordian. The ICS hasn't reached a decision on this yet, but the unique situation with the Anthropocene is that people are still alive today that remember the previous age, the Mecalaean of the Holocene epoch. Not only that, but it's clear from, well, everything, that this definition of the Anthropocene lines up with not only the lived experiences of those of us who lived through that transition, but also all of us who have learned about it in school or lived through the fallout of the war. We know, we can sense that things are different. And if the Crawford Lake isn't the Golden Spike, that doesn't mean that they've got the date wrong, it just means that the spot isn't a good candidate. Personally, I kind of assumed the Golden Spike would be somewhere in Kyushu. And there was another proposed site in Japan, but it was ultimately the runner-up for reasons I never really read about, but I'm not the expert here, so don't listen to me on that. Godzilla is part of that fallout, and while The Smoking Gun was the Castle Bravo test, the original film was carrying a decade's worth of baggage on its back. You couldn't make Godzilla movies during the occupation, so the first one essentially had to make up for lost time. Godzilla was born of that angst, which is why he can't exist prior to the war. And so for his whole life, Godzilla has been the Cold War monster, even well after the fall of the Soviet Union. Shin Godzilla steals its plot from the 80s and once again threatens to solve an issue created by nuclear weapons with nothing short of more nuclear weapons. It's who Godzilla is. It's his identity. He's defined by the Crawfordian age, and when you take him out of that context, he no longer makes any sense. Yamazaki could have easily put Godzilla in some sort of Rodan-like equivalent to the Hollywood movie's bafflingly stupid Hollow Earth thing, and have him be the direct result of the offensive bombings. He could have put Godzilla right up against the line where the war was still technically happening, just before Japan surrendered. He could have done it, and it could have very well been a great movie, who knows. But instead, he kept the established migratory reign of Godzillasaurus, and he pushed it back to the earliest Bikini Atoll tests in 1946. We still see the war. We still see Godzilla's tour of duty, as it were, and we see that he was both a victim and a perpetrator of these atrocities. But the movie isn't concerned with showing us 2 hours of Godzillasaurs on the Pacific Front. It is primarily concerned with, as most of us are, the aftermath of the war. The aftermath that we've all been living in for the past 79 years. Post-war extends forever. By the way, this movie is unconnected to any previous timelines, but I do think it's kind of chilling that the implication of this Godzilla being created by nuclear tests at the exact same test site implies that Godzilla could have shown up at literally any point after 1946, and every other timeline that wasn't -1 just got lucky by delaying the inevitable for at least 8 years because it just so happened that no Godzillasaurs happened to be migrating through the area before Castle Bravo. The reason it's a period piece, and the reason why we're pushing the clock back here then, is to change the perspective to focus on the immediate fallout. When Chikishima returns home, it's a pile of rubble. His parents' home barely exists anymore outside of a half-standing shed. Yamazaki isn't simply retreading the socio-political aftermath of nuclear tensions that so many Godzilla movies lean on. All of that is hand-waved with a couple of lines to explain why the US can't help them. Yamazaki needs -1 to be a period piece because time has made the human toll of the war progressively more abstract, more statistical. Instead, what we get within the 2 years the film takes place over is something resembling how we might view veterans of something younger, like Vietnam, Iraq, or the kind of anxiety people in Ukraine deal with right now. He's taken real life's all-consuming great backstory war, the mythologized horrors of war crimes and apocalypse weapons, and translated it into the direct consequences we see happening right now in the news, and in a time where the internet allows us to connect with people from all over the world, chances are you probably know someone directly affected by Putin's selfish war. I know that I do. For Godzilla, this is what the war is. More important than the details of what happened are the results of those happenings. The film only shows us a few stray bullets fired at the Godzillasaurus before the end of the war within the first 10 minutes or so, but it spends the next 2 hours dealing with the results of that encounter. As I've mentioned before, for the most part, Godzilla is the war for Shikishima. He is the only part of his wartime experience we're allowed to see as the audience, and the initial incident behind his entire character arc. Godzilla has played a lot of roles in his career, and strictly speaking, this isn't new either. The first 2 films drew explicit parallels to the experiences that all of the adult audiences would have lived through. What's new here is his participation, of course. The Godzilla of the original film carried Honda's angst, but this Godzilla is the cause of that angst. Shikishima and the other survivors are trying to rebuild. They're trying to continue living in the Crawfordian Age, this new post-apocalyptic world that they've been thrust into. But Godzilla, as he always does, won't let them. One of the most powerful moments of Shin Godzilla for me, especially after his 12-year absence, was the lyrics to the song Persecution of the Masses. It's been well established by now that the lyrics to another song from that score, Who Will Know, represent the viewpoint of Godzilla himself, a thing that should not be, that from some fluke of his monster movie biology has been forced to live on as some sort of god of death when he himself feels like little more than a walking corpse. While I've never heard it explicitly confirmed one way or the other if Persecution of the Masses is in the same boat, the lyrics very strongly speak for themselves, and while, in my opinion, they don't speak directly for Godzilla himself, they are indicative of the idea of Godzilla, that he will never go away. There aren't much to them, but the lyrics close out with, "Let no blame lie at the innocents who have prayed," followed by, as if in response, "If your high praise is all we have, let us not be without you." The pronouns read a bit confusingly, and the point of view isn't entirely clear, but the message is crystal. So long as we are like this, so long as we keep doing this, Godzilla is never going to let us go. At the time, this carried a dual meaning for me, as it not only doubled down on the need for Godzilla to exist in a post-war world, something that I, at the time, needed specifically to hear, but it is also a representation of the tenacity of Godzilla as a character. Godzilla the myth persists because ever since we went past the tipping point into the Crawfordian Age, we have never stopped giving Godzilla the monster reasons to punish us. More than that, in Godzilla's eyes, the mere fact that we are in the Crawfordian Age at all gives him every excuse to come back again and again. The mythology of Godzilla is eschatological in a sense. Mankind died the moment that we crossed the line and entered the Crawfordian Age, and the age itself is our collective hell. This isn't always our endpoint, but no Godzilla movie since the Heisei era has allowed the torment to stop, and even the ones with happy endings won't let us escape, either because of the inevitability of more recursive mistakes, or something as simple as Godzilla's inevitable return being foreshadowed. We don't normally think about the innocents in most Godzilla movies because the movies aren't framed that way most of the time. I should point out here that I'm an incredibly cynical and misanthropic person. I am, after all, part Godzilla. My outlook is quite grim, and to be honest with you, I don't know if our species will still exist by the time Godzilla turns 100. Between things like the unhinged despot of a nuclear state waging an unprovoked war that will almost certainly lead to the next World War, the complete and total lack of any effort to do a single goddamn thing about global warming, the terrifying resurgence of fascism, and about 1,000 other things, we really don't stand much of a chance against ourselves. We're so efficient at destroying everything that we touch that it's inevitable that such a social species would eventually destroy itself. It's not even just to boot everyone else that lives on this planet. We're poisonous to ourselves. And Godzilla has every right to repay tragedy with tragedy, because as long as there's less of us, it's a form of harm reduction. I'm not going to tell you that during Godzilla's attack on Ginza, I suddenly unprogrammed myself from 32 movies of human bad and felt nothing but sympathy. I'm not a liar. But it was different this time, because I've never seen him this angry before. GMK's Godzilla was reanimated by the victims of Japan's war crimes, and yet even that version paled in comparison to the hatred this Godzilla exuded. Not mere contempt, actual hate. There's not a moment in this film that allows the audience to believe that Godzilla is doing anything other than making a direct beeline for Japan to extract as much misery as possible. What I'm saying is that it scared me. Every Godzilla sequence in this film is paced like a horror movie, using the filmmaking tricks of a slasher film to extract tension from scenes. But I'm not big on slasher movies, and the Ginza attack was the only one that actually scared me. There's never anything fun about innocents who have prayed being killed alongside the guilty, but what Minus does is it puts the scene that the audience for a Godzilla movie has been conditioned for decades to interpret as the consequence of the folly of man into a movie where Godzilla is playing the role of the war. We see, at the same time, Godzilla simultaneously visiting on us the promised retribution and the exact thing that it is a retribution for, all in the same moment. In a way, it fuels the desire for revenge, turning what in previous films has been an emotionally cathartic special effects set piece into a self-perpetuating, emotionally devastating experience. And it ends with the third bomb. Now, that was my reaction after seeing the movie the first time. The second time, when I went back for Minus Color, having been a little bit more emotionally prepared for it, I picked up on a little additional depth to the sequence. I went off about this on Discord to my friends after I got back from the movie, so I'm just going to fit in what I wrote there, just in paragraph form. It kind of struck me that it's only the second time that I've seen it. Like, it's been in theaters this whole time. The last 3 went straight to Netflix, so I'd seen them a bunch of times already by now. But, like, there's stuff I didn't pick up on the first time. Like, for instance, Godzilla is played real hard like the killer in a slasher movie. And that is definitely how the film frames him. But not always. I was kind of blindsided by the meltdown because it felt like a gut punch to make Godzilla into Jason Voorhees, and then at the end have this homage to like the most genuinely upsetting thing that's ever happened to Godzilla. And like, it's no Shin, it's subtler than that. But it didn't actually come out of nowhere. So something I missed at first, because Shikishima was stealing the scene from the dude whose name is in the title. Godzilla's just standing there too, right? After the blast. It leaves your mind because of the situation with Noriko. That's where the audience's attention is drawn, because it's such an enormous tragedy, so you don't even notice that Godzilla's not doing any sort of victory roar or anything. And then they finally cut back to him, and it's not a continuity mistake. He's standing there. The whole movie, he's been a relentless driving force, but when you see him again, he's just staring at his own mushroom cloud. And like, you realize, that's the first time he's used it on land. He's figuring it out in real time, in the same moment that the audience in Shikishima, that's even a thing he could do. And that's way more intense because we're talking about an animal that has seen that type of explosion with his own eyes and lived. And there's also an even subtler bit that I liked when he takes down the DuPont Theater. He does it in this really kind of awkward way that he's never done before. The closest is Kamano-kun. He like kind of rubs his face into it. Overall, there's this kind of feeling in the way that he emotes, like he's sort of seeing all this for the first time. Generally, in a Godzilla movie, you kind of shrug and go, well, he's a metaphor, so of course he makes a beeline for Tokyo, which is, still why it's happening. But then there's just enough characterization there where he seems as confused as he is angry. It doesn't happen often that Godzilla movies treat him much like an actual animal, but when it does, I happen to really like it. Also, so in that moment with him watching the mushroom cloud, it made me appreciate the Genza attack more as someone who became a misanthrope largely because of the movies, because when he finally does do the victory roar, after taking a moment to soak in what has just happened, it feels like something kind of clicked in his head. Like, oh, now I can do the same thing to them. I've had a lot of nightmares about the bomb. Perhaps unsurprisingly for someone who lives and breathes Godzilla the way I do. The one I remember the most vividly is the one that I wrote down in a dream journal back in the early 2010s. Now, I can't read you that journal entry because it, along with most things I own, are in a storage place 30 minutes away by car, and I don't have a car, so I can't easily dig it up, and I don't have the space where I'm currently living to move everything over. But it has stuck with me all these years because of how terrifying it was, so I can still share it despite all of that. A little context first, though. As you will probably also not be surprised to hear, I've always been afraid of the bomb ever since I first learned what it even was. I was born before the Cold War ended, and I don't really have many concrete memories about living in that time. But they do start somewhere around 1990 to 1991, just after the Berlin Wall fell, but before the USSR dissolved. My parents are baby boomers, of course, and so while there isn't a lot of crossover between the memories of being a toddler with the angst of impending nuclear annihilation, I do need to stress that crossover does exist. My mom in particular, when I would start to talk about Godzilla, when I started comprehending things, would tell me that it was about the bomb, about how the film Godzilla meant something, that it was important, that it was about a terrible tragedy. This is extremely conventional knowledge for most people familiar with Godzilla movies. The first one was legit, and all the sequels were just vapid monster fights for children, that kind of thing. But I want you to understand that at the time, I was a child. And yes, I did think that the first movie was a little bit more boring than the others because it didn't have monster fights. But even then, I knew there was something there, even if I didn't know how to express it. A lot of it is conditioning, I imagine. I was told the other movies meant nothing, and I believed that for a long time, so I must have simply taken adults at face value when they said the first movie was the one that mattered, right? And I'm sure there is truth in that, but the thing that I can't get out of my head is, if that really was true, then why did I keep coming back to that movie of my own volition? Why would an actual child who really did just care about monster fights intentionally decide to just keep wearing out the tape of the most miserable movie I had access to? Why did I keep wanting to see it? The answer is pretty obvious. The power of the film is such that you don't really need to just rely on words or visual or sound alone. Working in concert, they all reinforce each other to create a greater whole. But film is an inherently collaborative medium. Making one completely alone is very rare, and With feature-length films, it's simply unheard of. Each part of Godzilla the movie is its own thing, and you don't need to be a Cold War historian or even particularly adept at whatever language you're watching it in to understand at least a part of what's going on. Tone doesn't have a language barrier or even an age barrier. People use the kinds of music and visuals they do to elicit emotions they want because we've worked out how to use art to achieve those types of expressions the artist intends. According to legend, as told to me by my mom, I saw my first Godzilla movie when I was 2 years old, and it was Godzilla, the first one. Technically, it was Godzilla King of the Monsters, the 1956 Americanization with Raymond Burr, but either way, it predates my earliest memory, so I can't confirm it, nor do I want to. Either way, I came into my conscious living timeline already with this seed planted into me. You know that thing where sometimes people will play Mozart for babies to make them smarter or whatever? I don't really know the science behind that or if there even is any at all and it's not just a marketing gimmick, but if you believe that, if you believe the legend, then I want you to think back to what I said earlier about me and Godzilla and the shared heartbeat and think about what it might mean that instead of Mozart, my preconscious mind was absorbing a monster movie about the bomb. My dad, meanwhile, said something to me when I was very young about the Cold War that has stuck with me just as hard. He said about the war that he thought it would never end. I wrote a whole essay based on that line 1 year for Deathiversary because that was my gimmick that year. I would write an essay at the end of every day. I was back in 2016, I believe. If you've been paying attention so far, you know that post-war extends forever. And you know that Godzilla will never leave us alone, and you also might have picked up on the fact that I feel the exact same way. The Cold War is nominally over, but we still live in the Crawfordian age, and I'm still anxious, and I'm not alone. A lot of ink has been spilled over this, and I don't want to get into the social media aspect of this because, frankly, I don't care much for social media, and I'm not really young enough to understand it anyways. But I don't even really think this feeling of anxiety is specifically social media's fault, at least not alone. What my dad meant by it was the nuclear tension between the US and the USSR, the immediate looming threat of the end of the world, the ticking of the doomsday clock. During the Cold War, the closest it ever got to midnight was 3 minutes in 1984, the same year Return of Godzilla came out. For most people who think of the war being between specifically the US and the USSR and treat conflicts like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan as spin-offs rather than fronts, the moment the USSR dissolved, the threat was over. For my dad, when he told me that, it had ended, and his long interminable nightmare, his personal Crawfordian age, ended. I think this extends to a lot of people, too. By and large, I don't think people are afraid of the bomb anymore. Nuclear plant disasters are incredible tragedies, but they're extremely rare, and when we see something like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, or Fukushima, we don't generally throw the entire concept of nuclear power plants under the bus, because as bad as those disasters are, we can count the statistical failures on one hand. People don't see nukes as real anymore. They're retro, a kitschy 80s thing. Nuclear radiation is a power source, not a boogeyman, and when you live your life in a world like that, Godzilla can start to seem irrelevant. It's no wonder, you might think, that the last 4 films were about 311, Grey Goo, suicide, and civilization as a whole, nor is it surprising that the new film has to be a period piece to make the nuclear threat scary again. For most people, the threat of the bomb isn't real anymore. Without looking it up, right now, do you know how long until midnight the doomsday clock is set to? It was changed again in January 2023 to 90 seconds. the closest to extinction the clock has ever been in its entire history. I'm still afraid of the bomb. I have always been afraid of the bomb, ever since before I could even comprehend what the bomb was. The mushroom clouds, the flash, the blast wave, the fallout, it terrifies me. It fills me with existential dread when even a single bomb remains. Up until this point, I've talked about the Crawfordian Age in a sort of vague way. I've lumped the bomb in alongside with the other horrors of war. I've mentioned the science happening in the soil that has a possible global correlation, which many people smarter than me believes defines post-war as a legitimate geological period. I've talked about the angst, the way people just sense that things are different now, the way my dad thought it would never end, whatever it is. I haven't just come out and say it because I'm afraid. I'm afraid that in the year 2023, people might think it sounds quaint or simplistic to boil things down to a cheesy 80s exploitation plot. But this is the bomb's fault. We're less than 2 minutes away from a nuclear holocaust. It isn't a joke. It never went away. Godzilla is real, and if we aren't careful, he is going to kill us all. The Crawfordian Age doesn't begin in 1950. It began in 1945. It started the moment we went down this path, the second that we drew Ghidorah's attention. When we dropped the bomb, we planted the seed of Godzilla. We grew the fruit of our own annihilation. We can work to prevent that catastrophe, but we can't put it back in the box now. For the entire rest of human civilization, our existence will be spent tending to this garden that we've created. Even in our best moments, all we are doing now is holding back the apocalypse for another day, and we are failing. Post-war extends forever. I started this section by mentioning a dream that I had wrote in my journal, one of my many nightmares about the bomb. I spent the rest of this section explaining why I have these kind of nightmares in the first place. The natural expectation is that I will now tell you exactly what happened in this said nightmare, but I don't have to do that, because Godzilla Minus One already replicated that nightmare on screen. The only difference is that instead of surviving the blast by hiding in an alley, I grasped onto the pole of a street sign. You'll have to ignore the nonsensical dream logic behind that, but in the dream, I wasn't Koichi. I was Noriko. I grasped onto that thing when I saw what was coming, and when it hit, I felt myself floating as if gravity had been turned off. Mercifully, I woke up soon afterwards, and in the context of the dream, I assume that must mean that I died in the blast. In the film, neither Koichi nor Noriko were so lucky, because they survived to see the next part, the Black Rain. I have never seen the Black Rain before. I've known about it for a long time. I've heard the stories about Lucky Dragon number 5 countless times, and I've seen every Godzilla movie at least 100 times, and those aren't the only Cold War horror films I've seen either. But I've never before in my life seen any movie, Godzilla or otherwise, show something so crucial to Godzilla's identity. I have always been afraid of the bomb, since before I even understood what the bomb was. I've heard Godzilla talk about it so many times, in so many movies. But this film, about trauma, is the first time Godzilla actually scared me, because he showed me the nightmares that he was responsible for giving me. Minus One has surprisingly little to say explicitly about the circumstances of the war, given how verbose it is with its more central themes. There is talk about Japan's attitude during the war, that the government was unconcerned with the value of lives, something no one in the room contends with. But by and large, we only see the surface. We only see what Kishima and Tachibana have been through. We don't know if any of the veterans present at the meeting of the Private Citizens Anti-Godzilla meeting witnessed the war crimes, is Honda dead, or maybe even participated in them. We only know that asking them to step up again and go back into danger is too much for some. Something I love so much about that scene where those who decline to help after the meeting filter out of the room is that no movie-esque rousing speech is ever offered to convince them all last minute, to stir their spirits. Other movies would rely on this, have Koichi stand up and tell everyone that they've got to pull together because blah blah blah. But instead, he nearly walks out himself just as the meeting is starting and has to be convinced to stay. Just 2 movies ago, this exact thing happened. It wasn't enough for the info dump about the discovery of Mechagodzilla's remains to stir people. Haruo had to give a speech. Yamazaki's restraint here speaks louder to me and is consistent with the film's anti-war message. You can't make these people go back, or else you're back to the same recursive mistakes of the Heisei-era Godzilla films. The scene is incredibly respectful about the film's main theme and primary thesis. That war not only destroys the lives of those that it kills, but also those of the survivors. As I've mentioned before, all of the Godzilla sequences are framed like it's a horror movie. Every once in a while, you'll hear something about Godzilla being scary, or even scary again, but I've personally never really understood that sort of thing. To me, the idea of Godzilla has always been inherently scary conceptually, as Godzilla is a product and expression of existential horror. But even in GMK, he's never bothered with personal horror. There have been a lot of different kinds of Godzilla movies over the decades. Salaryman comedies, utterly nihilistic movies about suicide, the one where he shakes hands with a robot. But there has never been a Godzilla horror movie before. In a couple of instances, the Shokolas and Juvenile Destroyer scenes come to mind. Parts featuring other monsters have been framed that way to varying success, but Godzilla himself has never run around with a knife and a hockey mask trying to stab anyone. Well, in this movie, he basically does run around in a hockey mask trying to stab people. This actually makes the happy ending feel more earned. The survivors of the war are our final girl. We expect, and I fully expected as I watched the movie follow so much of Planet Eater's plot thread, that a Godzilla movie this miserable, this terrifying, this blunt about what it is, that things will not end well for any of these people. Instead, Yamazaki gives us the first happy ending to a Godzilla movie in nearly 20 years. And it's fully justified, too. It doesn't, like Shin Godzilla, feel like it happens because the movie needs to end by inserting what are essentially Mary Sue politicians into the story to allow that to happen. On the surface, Shin and Minus are a little too optimistic. Politicians in the real world are the reason 311 turned into the basis for a Godzilla movie, and Minus, they invent a new rule about Godzilla not being able to fire his heat ray again for a plot-convenient amount of time, right at the moment where he should be easily obliterating the entire Citizens fleet. But Shin wants you to buy into the fantasy from the beginning, when they used Yaguchi as an audience surrogate to express frustration at the bureaucracy. So it's built into the fabric of the whole film, whereas Minus plays with the horror movie pacing of the Godzilla sequences to allow for last-minute saves to shape the dramatic tension in the only way their plan could ever work. Ono used writing to sell his false hope, but Yamazaki used editing, and editing is a lot harder for your brain to parse as raw data, so as a sequence the flow feels more natural. And when all is said and done, he gives us something we didn't expect. Now I want to qualify here what exactly I mean when I say happy ending and why I don't consider Shin Godzilla's ending to be that. Both films, being Shen and Minus, end with Godzilla being stopped, but in Shen, Godzilla is still in one piece, whole, and will inevitably unfreeze some point in the future. The last shot of the frozen fifth forms crawling out of his tail served to drive home this point, and we are told that Yaguchi allowed for the countdown of the bomb to be moved up unconditionally the moment Godzilla resumes activity, which means no evacuation whatsoever. At the end of the movie, they stop Godzilla, but winning the battle creates an uneasy peace with doom inevitably looming in the future. -1, on the other hand, gives us a family reunion of two people who are, to the audience, essentially ghosts. These people had already made their decisions. Both Koichi and Noriko had their Haruo moment already. It's over for them. They've made their peace with this world and have mentally and emotionally moved on. To give them both an out after that, to give them both life after they had already chosen to make their Serizawa-esque bargain, isn't just the practical happiness of getting their family back together, but it means that both of them are on the other side of a 2-year-long character arc about the trauma that they dealt with after the war. It's not just about family, it's about peace. And yes, we know Godzilla is going to come back. We would have known that even without the final shot of the Godzilla cells regenerating. He always does. But for this family, their story is resolved. So when I say -1 has a happy ending, but Shin Godzilla does not, what I'm saying is that there is a definitive resolution to the story being told. Shin Godzilla only pressed pause on the doomsday clock. Godzilla is still there, a literal monument to the garden Ghidorah will soon pick. But Koichi and his family are safe. Not forever, no, but we don't know how much of a time skip the sequel will cover, or even if the next Godzilla movie will be a sequel to Minus at all. Now, I spent all of that time trying to convince you that Godzilla -1 is a happy ending because, well, it doesn't, actually. I've seen a lot of people talking about the movie mention a growth on Noriko's neck, but full disclosure, I was too blindsided by a Godzilla movie having a happy ending that I didn't notice it the first time. And when I did see it the second time, I honestly thought it was a little too subtle and inconclusive to actually suggest anything. And again, no, I'm not talking about the regenerating tissue because did anyone think Godzilla was never coming back? No. What bothered me was something that I didn't really realize until I was headed back home. You've probably noticed it too if you've been thinking about it for long, or were paying attention during the last segment. While Godzilla's Ginza attack is the only part of the film that effectively scared me, there is an element of fridge horror. The bomb. Koichi and Noriko survived, sure. A lot of people survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki too, but so many of them did not. Noriko was caught in the blast wave and Koichi was drenched in the black rain, and presumably so was Noriko. So it isn't a death sentence, but survival isn't guaranteed either. In the end, even when survivors can find peace, even when they can deal with their trauma and build new lives for themselves, they are still living under the shadow of the bomb. They are still carrying Godzilla's curse. I've put this off long enough by dealing with the easy parts, because it's primarily the treatment of its themes that differentiate this movie from the Heisei-era Godzilla films. I've been able to go back to the most common, stock Godzilla themes and look at how Yamazaki deals with them differently. Mental health, and specifically trauma, isn't new either. It's not as common, but it's not new. The elephant in the room is the last Godzilla movie, Planet Eater, which this movie sticks pretty close to, which is about suicide. The difference is that most Godzilla movies use themes related to mental health only as a supporting cast rather than as the main event. The suicide movie, quote-unquote, only ever arrives at talking about suicidal ideation because of how Metphies frames the culmination of the more traditional Godzilla themes. The moment we created the bomb, we had already signed away our souls. Everything from that moment forwards was just another domino in the long line that leads ultimately to oblivion. Godzilla the Planet Eater asked an extremely personal and disarming question that I, as someone who lives and breathes Godzilla, and as someone whose personality is in large part a symptom of trauma, have had to ask myself over and over again. What's the point? Why go on? To hear the last Godzilla movie tell it, and indeed the way I've told it to myself for so long, being that Godzilla is just a mirror, realizing that we're 90 seconds to midnight as it is, when you run out of things to distract you, all you're doing is waiting out the clock. For Haruo, and for me, for a lot of my life, and particularly most of the 12-year gap, this has been the way that the world looks. The world is already destroyed, now it's just a matter of pride. And I'm not that proud. -1 can't top Planet Eater's nihilism. Nothing can, and there's no point in trying. And so it doesn't try. Again, Haruo and Koichi follow the same character arc. They start with a life robbed of purpose by Godzilla, they find hope in something that Godzilla becomes an obstacle to, and they create new purpose in revenge against Godzilla for taking hope away from them. By the end of their journeys, they have already reached the natural conclusion of that thought process. Neither of them in the third act of their arcs are fighting to stay alive anymore. By the time Planet Eater begins, Haruo has already realized his crusade against Godzilla has failed. He is starting from nothing, and he is only able to find closure by ensuring the safety of the people who still have life left. In the end, he flies his weapon of war directly into the mouth of Godzilla, like an Ouroboros biting its own tail, sacrificing himself to stop the cycle of violence. When Koichi loses Noriko, destroying Godzilla is his only purpose, and like Haruo, by the time that the opportunity presents itself, he no longer thinks it's even possible. He, too, has a child to protect, and he makes the same decision that Haruo does, but this time he survives and Godzilla dies. In Planet Eater, trauma is the conclusion, suicide is the resolution, and peace is found in a world without mankind, who is the reason Godzilla exists. In -1, trauma is the product, suicidal ideation is a symptom, and peace is found in a world without Godzilla, who is the reason trauma exists. You have your fear, which could become real, and you have Godzilla, which is real. To do all this, the trauma of Shikishima can no longer be just a simple plot point. And so for the first time, Godzilla has taken a very visceral look at the symptoms of PTSD and not just the causes. It ranges between subtle clues that you might not pick up on if you haven't experienced it, like the ever-decreasing stability of Koichi's hands, to the derealization scene. I'm going to talk about the derealization scene. This section is about the derealization scene. I don't know what to call the trigger warning for this, but again, that's what we're going to be talking about now. For a little context, because it occurs to me that there may be people listening to this who have never experienced it, let alone on a regular basis, and may not understand what it is, let's start by looking at how Koichi is affected immediately post-war. He cheated death to come home to his family dead, his parents' house destroyed, and Sumiko, who is of course the best character in the movie, blaming him for everything and hating him for coming back alive at all. So this is survivor's guilt, and I can't personally understand this fully because I've never been to war, let alone a war where kamikaze pilots existed, but my understanding of it is that it feels like something of a much more dire cousin of imposter syndrome. There's a fakeness to it. The fact that you come back rather than some of your comrades that you feel deserved it more. There's a kind of weight to it, like a burden it places on you, because now it's your job to live for the people who deserve to survive when you yourself didn't. And so right off the bat, it's not something as simple as a full-on existence is meaningless type of thing like in Planet Eater. It's more complicated than that, because whether or not Koichi even wants to survive at this point is immaterial. What's important is that he feels that his continued existence is an error or some sort of cosmic joke being played on him. He isn't here because he's supposed to be. He's the great value stand-in for the better people that died because of his mistakes. Fairly soon after, we meet Noriko and Akiko. Noriko is a very pragmatic person. A mother is killed in the raids, but saves the baby, so now someone has to take care of the baby. That's just how it is. Now someone's got to care for the baby somehow, and Akiko can't manage to do it herself, so Noriko is going to have to find a way. That's just how it is. From her perspective, Koichi may as well be playing hard to get, but it doesn't matter either way, because she has to take care of this baby now. That's the most important priority. Everything else is just a means to an end. That's just how it is. Of course, we all know about how Koichi never really pushes back, and we know why Sumiko steps in to help. What's more interesting is the establishment here of a symptom that will consistently cling to Koichi for nearly 2 years. The inability to allow himself to be happy, which is another symptom of survivor's guilt. He isn't necessarily trying to form walls to block off relationships, because obviously he doesn't want this kid to starve, and Noriko sure as hell wasn't doing the best job on her own. It's more that he doesn't feel like he deserves to see the light on the other side when no one else he was at war with did. And even worse, it's his fault they're dead. The way I talk about Godzilla, you'll have noticed by now, is pretty similar to the way the movies themselves talk about their themes. I like to call a spade a spade. Godzilla firebombing Tokyo? No, that's just a real thing that happened. The US and USSR with their fingers on the button, ready to push it because of the remote possibility that maybe possibly Godzilla could surface again? No, that's just a real thing that happened. The government dragging their feet into a web of convoluted bureaucracy as the Godzilla situation is clearly out of control and they're wasting valuable time not enacting any tangible actions? No, that's just a real thing that happened. When Koichi dreams of being back on Odo Island, that Godzilla is somehow still out there and coming for him, waking up as an anxious, incoherent mess in the middle of the night, and no longer even being fully aware whether he's even alive anymore, or if his brain is just living out one final dream before it shuts off. The presence of Godzilla in that scenario does not make it a fictional event. The scene is real. It's happened to real soldiers returning from war. It happened to me. And the accuracy of the depiction is so startlingly, upsettingly real that it was difficult for me to relive. I don't know what seeing this movie is like for veterans, but I do know what it's like for me, and as much as it hurts to watch any of the other times Godzilla movies don't pull their punches, this one hurts a lot more. In Planet Eater, the movie just restated a thesis statement I agreed with, but now the Godzilla of the Reiwa era is confronting the reality of the evils of civilization by making me relive the experiences I have been through personally. Derealization is a feeling where the world around you no longer seems real. It's a difficult experience for me to explain. If you've ever been in a situation where you aren't sure if you're awake or dreaming, but you later end up discovering you're awake, it's like that. Your senses seem to be fighting their own input. Stuff feels murky. Your body feels detached from its environment, like you're floating, or that you're an outside observer looking in on a scenario you're not actually a part of. Wow, that's really fucked up, you might think. I'm glad none of that is real or actually happening to me. Could you imagine? This kind of feeling is usually precipitated by an extreme shock. If you've ever felt it or need a clear idea of what I'm talking about, think about how it felt after hearing the worst news you've ever heard. A really crushing death, some kind of personal tragedy, something that cost you a lot. It doesn't matter what the cost was, just that it was a lot of it. If you remember during those times feeling a kind of shock where you feel like what's happening isn't real anymore, then you depersonalized. For people with PTSD, this can happen over and over again without needing any initial shock anymore. One way that I explain stuff about my PTSD to people that seems to work is to think of it as that old adage about touching a hot stove. If you don't know what hurts beforehand, once you touch it, you'll know, and you won't do it again. Now, imagine your whole world is filled with hot stoves. People are hot stoves. Things are hot stoves. Places are hot stoves. Abstract concepts or vague topics are hot stoves. They may not necessarily even be hot anymore, but because you touched it once and it burned you and you're not stupid, you're still not going to do it again. Now, as I said, I don't think Koichi is holding Noriko and Akiko at arm's length because he thinks they're hot stoves. That doesn't seem to be what the film is trying to say. Instead, it seems clear to me that he considers his continued existence, in the face of everything that's happened, that this nice lady and cute child dropped into his lap after walking away alive from not just his duty as a kamikaze pilot, but from a confrontation with Godzilla. He's being given a fairy tale ending, and something in his brain isn't letting that click into place. For Koichi, and for me, the hot stove is actually a type of physical pain. Extremely high levels of anxiety can give you headaches. They can make you feel nauseous, affect motor control. It can feel like you're suffocating, and the chest pains. Holy shit, the chest pains. You don't really have control over when you feel like this. You have a modicum of control over what happens after the pain sets in. You can choose how you handle it, but you can't just make it never happen again unless you avoid all possible stimuli that could lead to it. The more stimuli that look like hot stoves, the more afraid you are of acting and behaving in certain ways, because certain actions and behaviors can lead to possible hot stove encounters, and now you need to start planning your life around that. What you say, how you say it, who you engage with, how you engage with them, where you go, what you do when you get there. When you are scared enough of something that it can radically alter how you function as a person, as a result, your life becomes dominated by fear. Because not only are you afraid of hot stoves, but you're spending a lot of your mental and emotional energy on avoiding them. And because of that, you create new fears for yourself about how your possible avoidance mechanisms could be compromised. What if Godzilla is still out there? What if he could come back and take Noriko and Akiko away? What if the sole reason Godzilla came for you in the first place was because you abandoned your duty as a Zero fighter? What if he's going to come back for you now because you sacrificed all those other lives so you could get away? You would have no way of knowing that wasn't true. No one's seen a 15-meter-tall non-alien deep-sea dinosaur tear through a group of soldiers like paper. Unlike Ikehara from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the story was covered up by the government, and officially that experience you had never happened. If the official word is that Godzilla doesn't exist, all you have to trust is your own systems, and how can you ever trust those anymore? Is he real? Is he a ghost? Did you die on Odo Island and Godzilla is coming back to claim your soul? I cannot make it clear enough how real this line of reasoning is. Again, introducing Godzilla into the equation here, please listen and believe me when I say this, because I am speaking from experience. The fact that Godzilla is a part of the math in Koichi's head does not make this train of thought less of a real thing that has actually happened. Because when you live your whole life in a state of perpetual fear, nothing you can do will ever stop it from hurting. Because even when you take every precaution, it will seep into your dreams. You'll have nightmares so painful you'll be afraid to sleep. Because now even your dreams have become hot stoves. Godzilla is just a placeholder, an abstract representation of a real thing that causes real damage. And for Koichi, Godzilla is something so painful that even involuntarily dreaming about him can cause a relapse to make you question whether or not you're still even alive. I'm being emphatic about this as a reality because it is my reality. I can't tell you how many times I've questioned whether or not reality is real. I'm currently not even 100% convinced that I haven't just been living in some weird rundown section of hell for the past 3 years. And I couldn't tell you how many times before that I've seriously, and again emphatically I do mean that I took the hypothesis seriously, questioned the same thing. I've often wondered whether or not I'm living in some sort of Matrix-like simulation, where everything around me is created by an advanced algorithm specifically created to extract the maximum amount of suffering out of me by continually waving hope in front of me for long enough for me to believe it, and then immediately burn it to the ground. Normally such an idea sounds ridiculous, but when you see the exact same pattern happening over and over and over and over again for something like 15 years, human brains are hardwired to recognize patterns, to see meaning in them. As evidence continues to mount, what starts as an exaggerated joke stops being funny. After all this time, I've been conditioned to despise the very idea of hope. Because it's not real. I know it's not real. I've seen over a decade's worth of hard evidence that positive outcomes are impossible. I'm no longer capable of believing that anything will work out because nothing ever has. For me, hope is a poison reality uses to hurt you. If you can understand how it's possible for me or anyone else to arrive at these conclusions, then you will readily understand the real reason Koichi holds Noriko and Akiko at arm's length. It's not something as simple as just guarding emotions. He's been conditioned to believe happiness isn't even real. In the end, the path to healing for Koichi is being able to even consider forgiving himself. Before Tachibana installs the ejector seat, Koichi is spiraling along the same course Haruo did, and it isn't until he chooses life that he stops treating it like a hot stove. There isn't really any romantic chemistry on screen between Koichi and Noriko, and while I imagine part of that is because of a Japanese cultural thing, I guess, maybe, I don't know. I've seen other Godzilla movies where this isn't the case, and more importantly, I can understand Koichi's priorities throughout the film. It was always something built out of necessity. After all, Noriko is a very pragmatic person, and I think all three of them, including Sumiko here, understand that the child is the priority. But that doesn't actually matter. Like, the question of survival, the question of any kind of romance or intimacy is immaterial. What's important here is that Koichi is grateful to have anything again. Really, life could have continued as a single dad, or just with his new friends and job. He could have made it through no matter what, because choosing to pull the lever was the decision. The reason he's so overjoyed at the end of the film is simply because he was given much more than that. And there is a retroactive realization happening here that he really was handed a fairy tale ending in the immediate aftermath of real life's great backstory war. For all we know, he could have been holding on to this the whole time, or maybe all he cared about was Akiko. I don't know, and again, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that Yamazaki went full Honda here, showing us not only the exact specifics on how trauma makes people's lives unlivable, but also a very Honda-esque naive optimism about how people can recover and survive. For those of you who know some basic stuff about Storytelling 101, you've heard about the concept of character arcs. That a character, chiefly the protagonist, starts off one way, goes through some events, and then comes out the other side affected, changed, and grown somehow because of those experiences. This is the simplest of simple stuff that everybody knows and almost every story features. Functionally, mechanically, Koichi Shigeshima is the protagonist of Godzilla -1 and has a character arc. He begins in the aftermath of the war with terrible trauma from his experiences, and through finding a new purpose in life and confronting the reality of his fears, he is able to begin acknowledging that and starts the healing process. This is a character arc in service to the central thesis of a Godzilla movie, an extremely typical stock theme that he's been preaching about since day one, the war, which tells a satisfying story conveying those ideas packaged within the world's most perfect, beautiful monster as the delivery mechanism of said ideas. It's quite simple, and everyone understands this, and you don't need to be a film major to figure this stuff out. This is why the movie has done so well abroad. Godzilla movies usually don't do this. So let's say again that you're a standard moviegoer, one of the mythical general audience, or hell, even a professional film critic for that matter. The level of education isn't important here. It's the level of familiarity with Godzilla that I want to get into. You probably know that Godzilla movies are, to put it delicately, preachy. We're going to ignore for a moment the contention of people who say, first movie good, all sequels bad, because their opinion is about as relevant to any discussion involving Godzilla as a chicken fart in a snowstorm. Like, negative infinity wouldn't even begin to describe how worthless and invalid that perspective is. We're talking about people who saw Shin Godzilla in 2016 or 2017 because of all the hype and agreed that it was very good and also definitely a Godzilla movie, which they would define as the kind of movie where scientists, military officials, and politicians all stand around in a room and repeatedly bash the audience over the head with the stated theme of the film by literally stating the theme. We could also talk about people who saw other Godzilla movies, and for my example here, we don't need to focus on how serious the Godzilla movie in question takes its themes. We could throw in Megalon alongside Biollante. It doesn't really matter. Notice the similar tendency to defer to this method as the primary delivery mechanism for meaning. The monsters stand in for something awful, and the characters all sit in a series of meanings and tell us what the problems the monsters are standing in for. And the monsters fight. People have been making this observation as long as there have been Godzilla movies to make this observation about. Henry G. Saperstein famously regarded this as a major problem in the pacing of the films, and that's because he was a businessman in the entertainment industry who was pretty pragmatic, that might be our word of the day, and knew that kids were coming to see these movies because of the monster fights, and the dry delivery mechanism for heady themes the movies weren't really taking seriously at that point, was hurting their appeal and marketability. This is seen by this fairly inclusive demographic of people not very familiar with Godzilla to not be a marketing issue. Rather, generally the consensus among that group is that the failure of this structure is because it doesn't make for a good story, because it doesn't rely on a protagonist with a character arc. There is, after all, a reason that paradigm is so conventional in the first place. It only became a convention because it works really well, really consistently. So people who were weaned on Hollywood scripts, which are completely paint-by-numbers affairs in all regards, view the lack of interpersonal drama as a failure that doesn't allow them to engage much with the ideas they're being presented with. This leaves little else for them to talk about aside from how cool the special effects set pieces are, i.e. monster fights, which yes, are always really cool. Now, from a mechanical standpoint, if you learn film criticism through the lens of, is this interpersonal drama engaging to me on an emotional level to the point where I can directly connect to a specific character so that I care about what's happening, then sure. You can call that a fault of a number of Godzilla films. I will say, of course, that this is a stereotype. There are many exceptions long before -1. There are, after all, 33 of these fucking things now, but that's not really important. What's important is that this point of view completely bypasses what a Godzilla movie actually is. Now, there's a more wordy way of getting here, which involves talking about the nature of art. See, because art actually isn't a science, good ideas can be replicated and iterated on, yes, but there is actually no accounting for what makes art resonate with people or why. Sometimes something will come along that tosses aside all established laws for a given medium and it makes waves and wows. Sometimes things make waves specifically because they eschew all traditional dogma about the medium they're working in, and sometimes they're just weird little accidents or outsider art by people with no understanding of what the rules even are. There are always exceptions because the universe is messy, but because art is something so nebulous and conceptual in nature to begin with, no matter how hard you try to nail it to the wall, you're always going to drip some on the floor. You just can't avoid it. And some of those drips are Godzilla. Now, be prepared, because I'm going to say something that's gonna sound kind of batshit, but I really hope by now that when I say I understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Godzilla, that you can trust me. Koichi Shikishima is the protagonist, but he is not the character that experiences the requisite audience surrogate character arc. Yes, I know. Obviously, from Yamazaki's perspective and from most people's perspective, he definitely is. But I want you to follow me on this short little journey because I think it'll help you understand the inner workings of how a Godzilla movie actually functions and why they work that way. Sumiko is the character with the arc, and she's the one that fills in as an audience surrogate, not Koichi. And I have multiple precedents for this interpretation that I'll be getting into in a second here. She starts the film filled with anger and agony. She hates the war. She hates reality. She hates living. And she hates everyone involved in the war, particularly Koichi. She hates all of this stuff because of what it did, and her initial incident as a character is seeing Akiko. Unlike Noriko, she's not nearly as traumatic. There's the word of the day again. And unlike Koichi, her trauma and anxiety manifest in a substantially different way. There are a lot less people who have lived through wars than people who haven't that are still alive. A larger group of people includes everyone who deals with any kind of debilitating trauma, but again, this outgroup is larger still. Koichi is not an everyman. He's not Kevin Bacon leading you through a world of dense Godzilla lore. He is the dense Godzilla lore, this time manifested as a single character rather than a series of meetings. Sumiko is the average Japanese civilian. She's hurt, she's angry, she's confused, and her life is in shambles. She didn't see the shit Koichi did. If she did, she never would have talked to him that way, with a flippant tone somewhat like the kids. All she saw was the result of the decisions she had no control over. She doesn't carry any guilt with her because none of this even remotely resembles anything you could charitably convince her is her fault. She didn't have a damn thing to do with it. She has to discover new purpose in life, same as any of the other survivors, and that purpose comes in the form of Akiko. But you'll notice the way she undergoes this change is a hell of a lot more straightforward and, dare I say it, almost Hollywood-like. Koichi has to deal with a lot of symptoms the majority of the audience have probably never felt, and the way he grapples with them is handled mostly internally, even though this is a movie and typically you show and don't tell in movies, you know? By comparison, Sumiko starts off as an ordinary person who had no control over any of this, who's filled with nothing but hatred and resentment for the world she is now forced to live in, who, by the end of the film, is only angry at Koichi, not because of any of that other crap, but at the fact that he has a shared responsibility for a child and is ditching all of that for a personal vendetta in a train of logic she can't even begin to wrap her head around. For Sumiko, it's very simple. War is bad because it hurts people, and children shouldn't be abandoned. She forgives Koichi when she sees he's taking on more important responsibilities, because her priorities align in a very simple, morally rigid way. We, as the audience, have information she's not privy to, so we know that lashing out at Koichi is a mistake, but because we know her priorities are very simple and direct, when she immediately begins to drop the gruff exterior when she realizes the stakes, it gives the audience a kind of catharsis. She's Furukawa, from Son of Godzilla, a movie that doesn't take its themes very seriously at all and is very much just meant to be fun. But as is typical for a Godzilla movie, it can't help but introduce a plot thread that relies on humans going where they're not wanted and fucking shit up. So Dr. Kasumi, played by a bafflingly cast Tadashi Takashima, is testing some weather control devices on a South Pacific island with the intention of determining the viability of turning land in normally unfarmable climates into places where more food could be grown in anticipation of overpopulation problems. Good intentions, but we know what is said to be paved with those. Instead, a mechanical malfunction caused by a baby Godzilla, a monster humans are responsible for making in the first place, causes shit to go even further south and the island is swept up in a radioactive heat storm. Furukawa, one of the science crew on the island, is already completely over the whole thing, just absolutely done with the awful, suffocating heat and the constant threat of giant monsters. The movie has no human villains, nobody's really to blame here, but Furukawa's sour disposition turns outright hostile when the heat gets even hotter and the giant monsters get even more gigantic. Furukawa, played by the incomparable Yoshio Tsuchiya, who was probably old Japanese film's classiest act, and I do not say that lightly, spends most of the film complaining, and while the other characters are discovering various bits of arcane Godzilla lore, about the daughter of a scientist who lingered on the island after the war, about giant mutant animals formed from mankind's meddling, all that classic Godzilla stuff, he becomes increasingly less patient, more unhinged, and more blatantly antagonistic towards the other characters. For him, the mission was a failure, and his continued presence here is a complete waste of time. This reaches a peak when he and most of the other cast fall victim to some good old island madness, and Furukawa grabs a gun and starts shooting hysterically. The illness is cured, and at the final action set piece of the film, as the cave the cast has taken up residence in crumbles around them as the monsters battle on the surface, they come up with the idea to try the weather control device again in an attempt to freeze the monsters. The response is mostly lukewarm, but then, suddenly, Furukawa throws 100% of his weight behind it, because now the stakes are a lot bigger than just his personal bad time. And what's more, he recognizes that not only that doing this will potentially save their lives, but it reignites his dormant scientific curiosity that drove him to this island in the first place. The conditions aren't ideal, but someone has to do it, and god damn it, it's the whole reason he even came to this godforsaken island in the first place. He's been through too much shit now to leave without even trying. The protagonist of Son of Godzilla is Goro Maki, the reporter, who doesn't have a character arc at all. He exists purely as a Kevin Bacon. He stumbles into things so other characters, Dr. Kasumi and Reiko, can do the Godzilla movie thing and deliver the core ideas of the film to him for the benefit of the audience. Furukawa doesn't play a part in any of that. He's not even really a villain, despite the fact that he comes into conflict with the other characters so often. His function in a non-Godzilla movie might be seen as just a stellar character actor completely upstaging the principal leads every time he's on screen. In a Hollywood movie, he would just be Johnny Depp or something like that. But here, his presence is meant to contextualize the theme of the film and the way we would think of being the traditional responsibility of a protagonist. Furukawa, Sumiko, Maina, Dr. Shiragami, Sarah, Admiral Tachibana, half the cast of Shin Godzilla, controversially, Yuki from Space Godzilla, and so on. These characters would form the heart of a traditional story's protagonist. It's an outgrowth of an older tradition, the classic Honda ensemble woman character moral pivot, the ideological, ethical center of the film that is ultimately responsible for setting into motion the events that resolve the story. The traditional Godzilla structure features an ensemble cast facing a terrible tragedy where answers don't come easy. Saperstein's much maligned meeting scenes deliver the thematic content of the film, and then the ensemble cast struggles in vain to make a difference in the corrupt world of man, and then a woman finally steps in and makes a hard choice that resolves the conflict. This is how the original Godzilla worked, and the Quickie sequel followed that framework, albeit in a kind of hollow way. With Godzilla's revival in the hands of Shinichi Sekizawa, and with the monster fights being clearly established as the iterative function that was going to make these movies financially viable, he tweaked the formula a little bit, as established in Honda's anti-capitalist trilogy, being Mothra, King Kong vs. Godzilla, and Mothra vs. Godzilla. Now, with Godzilla's attention drawn to other things, the blame could fall solely on the people who were directly responsible for the situations that created Godzilla in the first place. And the monster plots were allowed to resolve themselves by having Godzilla ultimately seek out the problem and destroy it. So the Honda moral pivot lady instead creates a situation where Godzilla is capable of doing this. Yuriko Hoshi is the one who convinces Mothra to intervene. Ghidorah's cast is stacked with multiple characters filling this role at each act, and Monster Zero defined Kumi Mizuno's career by making her one of these characters. When the series was passed to different teams, the trend mutated, and this is where we find Furukawa, who at this point no longer really has anything to resolve. The bad guys became faraway things like terrorists and aliens, and the minute Godzilla gets loose on the enemy monster, it's all over. So rather than carrying major themes on his back, all Furukawa had to do at that point was portraying how an ordinary person, in non-Godzilla movies, the audience's surrogate or protagonist, would react to the situation. Think about it. Son of Godzilla contains no hard questions. Everything is self-contained. People try to do shit, it messes things up, and now they have to resolve the situation they created. But it's a fantasy thing that hadn't actually happened in 1967. And it isn't meant to be some kind of prophetic warning about cloud seeding or anything. It's just a fun toku romp for kids. Furukawa in this movie is somewhat vestigial for the original body plan of a Godzilla plot, but Sekizawa, more than any other singular person, is hugely responsible for creating that plan in the first place. And the dude knew what he was doing, so Furukawa being there isn't a mistake. It's not just to upstage Akira Kubo, either. Furukawa may not be a woman, and the plot may no longer fully pivot around him, but that essential arc, that connection to the soul of the idea of the movie, that archetype that Emiko established in the first film, that's still a part of the character's DNA. During the Heisei era, the concept evolved again. After the 70s, where the whole format changed to Godzilla fights space monster, has some sort of problem, humans fight the aliens, and then resolve the problem, and then Godzilla wins, the lighthearted nature of Godzilla movies crumbled in the face of the Second Cold War, and once we arrive at Godzilla vs. Biollante, all of Honda's optimism is just gone. Biollante still uses the basic structure, though. There's an ensemble cast to deal with the tragedy, meanings package the central themes as Godzilla lore for the delivery mechanism, and while the ensemble struggles against the world of man to try to resolve the conflict, the real resolution comes from... Well, there's a reason Biollante is mankind's greatest work, but I'll get to that in a minute. All of the major casts from Biollante have arcs. None of them are able to leave that situation unchanged, although they don't all change at the same time. Major Kuroki starts as a young, untested soldier where he can see some tension from his superiors who manages some success, but as the heat ramps up and it becomes increasingly clear that Godzilla will always defy all expectations, he focuses in on his priorities and learns that failure in one perspective can be a stepping stone to achieving things that are actually important, which goes hand in hand with the arc of, say, Dr. Kirishima, who starts off profoundly cynical and ends being proven right time and time again, but in the end rejects the symbolic confirmation of his ideals, which is his invitation to Massachusetts, because he's come to a sobering realization that matches something said by Dr. Shiragami earlier in the film. Dr. Shiragami, then, is the heart of the film. He starts the movie as a broken father, angry at the world, and seeing it in a way you might if you were, say, a misanthropic trans woman with PTSD who watches too many Godzilla movies. That the moving parts seem constantly designed to chew people up, going through a seemingly never-ending grieving process that turns him quite literally into a mad scientist. He's the one who tells Kirishima that science is just another tool of politicians. He's the one that first coins the sentiment echoed throughout the Heisei era of Godzilla that science doesn't have room for sentimentality, and he's the one who replies to Kirishima's thought of it being time to step aside and make room for a new generation, that as long as we keep doing the same things, we can't call it a new generation. Now, I could talk about Godzilla vs. Biollante literally forever, but my point in bringing it up here is to illustrate that the mechanical functions of a Godzilla film, because Shiragami isn't just another scientist in a meeting delivering packets of Godzilla lore. He's a human being whose life has been destroyed by the effects of the Godzilla lore being delivered. He's speaking from experience. He's Sumiko, angry at soldiers because of the devastation of the war. He's Furukawa, angry at the dogged insistence of continuing the experiment even when they've done enough damage to the island. He's Sarah, holed up in her room alone, wondering why they brought a monster back to life instead of her mother. Mina, angry at the Sky People for stirring up a nature god they've been living in peace with for thousands of years. Yuki, filled with the vengeance because of the death of his friend, or Admiral Tachibana with his nihilistic outlook on the way Japan not only forgets, but actively tries to cover up the past. The problem isn't that Godzilla movies have never had any compelling characters, and you know that. You wouldn't be in this far if you didn't. But all of those characters are just a piece of the puzzle. We already know that -1 isn't really about Sumiko. It's about Koichi and a survivor's guild. Likewise, we know that the real protagonist of Godzilla x Mechagodzilla is Akane, not Sarah. Sarah is just a more traditional form of the Lady Moral Pivot. She's the reason Akane's outlook changes in the third act. But Akane is the star of the show and the main dramatic center. Sarah is really only there so that Akane's feelings of worthlessness can be challenged, so her connection to Kiryu can be recontextualized to deliver the theme, that no life is worthless. Mina ultimately can't stop the inevitable from happening, but she was never going to because it's fucking Godzilla the Planet Eater. Of course it's not going to have a happy ending. But, in a way, Haruo did win, because his destruction of the last remnant of Mechagodzilla creates a future for his child to grow up in. Mina isn't a main character there, but her efforts weren't meaningless, because we know that she got through to him in the end. Her perspective changed things. It served as a catalyst for Haruo to deliver the end of the story. In this way, protagonists in Godzilla movies, ensemble or otherwise, don't need character arcs because they aren't necessary to deliver the theme. The pivot does that work for them. The meetings are there to establish the stake. That's the exposition. The monsters are the inciting incident, and the pivots do the emotional legwork. Kirishima, for example, changes as a result from his experiences with Shiragami, Biollante, and the situation with the Aneb. But his arc is a hell of a lot more subtle than Shiragami's, because Shiragami actually gets closure. Dramatically, meetings are a mechanical weakness if you treat movies as paint by numbers, and I won't argue otherwise. But as I've thoroughly explained here, that's not how Godzilla movies work. It seems like -1 works this way, and certainly functionally it does that, and again, that traditional perspective is completely valid, and I'm sure Yamazaki very much intended for Koichi Shikishima to be the main protagonist and have his big important character arc and all that. But we've got nearly 70 years of precedent to work with here, and when you can see the matrix code of these movies the way I can, Koichi is just the meetings. Yamazaki made the movie palatable for people who don't like Godzilla movies, but it's still a Godzilla movie. Hollywood doesn't understand Godzilla because Hollywood works in budgets so astronomically high that calling modern blockbusters risk-averse is the greatest understatement of the millennium. They just straight up can't afford to lose, so they have to cater, usually to China, and there's really no room to consider any kind of alternative structure. As we've discussed, Godzilla movies don't really rely on that structure. They definitely can follow it, though. And the way -1 is fit into that has gotten a lot of people to sit up and take notice. People are calling out Hollywood on its bullshit. They always have been, sure, but the juxtaposition between this widely released real Godzilla movie and Hollywood's continued hilariously hollow attempts to copy Toho's homework has made the problems inherent in Hollywood's bloat plain to see even for the most casual observer. Predictably, when presented with a property like Godzilla, the skeleton of the meetings, the pivot, and the man versus man where monsters resolve it no longer fit into their plan to make back most of their money in China. It's too cerebral, because when you make that kind of movie, you have to rely on the audience actually caring about what the movie is saying from the outset. You can't just be tricked into caring about fictional characters because they have a hard time when you're presented with people just straight up stating facts at you. Godzilla is a problem for them, because even though you can have characters in a Hollywood movie say stuff like, man is a worse monster than Godzilla, that can't actually be the whole point of your movie. You need a Kevin Bacon. You need to have someone come down with the case of the not gays. You need to have toys to sell. You need make 1 billion action set pieces and then force your animators to crunch and not pay them for it. So they hang on to what they know. They give you the obvious focal character, the son of the dad from Malcolm in the Middle, or the white guy who knows a couple things about wolves and so gets to boss around an entire organization that study monsters but doesn't seem to know a single damn thing about them, including the only Japanese character in what is supposedly a Godzilla film. Cool movie. And then those characters never work because the characters are so stupid and awful that nobody cares about them. So that's out. Then they try to just get you to come see my monster fights, and then that doesn't work because the first 2 times you couldn't actually see what was happening. And so they made Godzilla look like a bear wearing an alligator suit with tree trunks for feet instead of like, Godzilla. Then finally, in the last one, they just said, fuck it. We don't know how to write characters people care about, so we're just going to go all out on the set pieces and make it so the audience can actually see what's happening and make all the King Kong stuff bizarrely solid, and then make the whole rest of the movie so batshit insane that you have to see it twice to make sure you didn't hallucinate it the first time. And that worked. And now they have enough of a hit to justify the next one, coming out at the end of this week, and boy, oh boy, I don't know how the hell they did it, but it's somehow even more incomprehensible and stupid looking than the last one. Personally, I can't wait. I'll be on the theater on opening day, high as a kite, maybe even with bells on if I can find some. People didn't really notice there hadn't been a Godzilla movie for a while because, well, for most people, Hollywood Godzilla wasn't really any different or less than any other Godzilla movie to them. Sure, there's a lot less meanings, but if you go with that stereotype, your perception is that Godzilla movies really only care about preaching to you in between the monster fights, and human characters were never really that important to the series. This is, of course, not strictly true, but it does kind of hide the fact that the reason humans matter in Godzilla is because they're the whole reason he's there in the first place. I've actually heard people talk about wanting a MonsterVerse movie that takes place before humans that's literally just monster fights, which is, first of all, not possible. Like, Godzilla can't exist before the bomb. That doesn't make any fucking sense. But also the idea is so antithetical to Godzilla's core being and so unbelievably stupid that it's probably true, so expect that movie soon. So humans are there because it's a fact of any Godzilla story that they are the catalyst for his appearance. You never really need interpersonal drama to express this idea. You can have a Godzilla movie with no character arcs at all, and a few of those already exist, and it would make no tangible difference in how well the movie does as a way of conveying whatever idea Godzilla is communicating in that moment. Godzilla vs. Gigan doesn't have any character arcs. It's more or less just a feature-length version of an Ultraman episode, although less so than Megalon. But the only time in the movie it does try to say something profound, the lack of any real meaningful drama doesn't undercut that at all. The ideas are just not related to each other. That the Nebulans want Earth specifically because it's being actively transformed into a garbage planet is delivered point blank in a meeting scene, and nothing the comic book artist, kung fu girlfriend, or hippie couple do have any bearing on that. But for a lot of people, that seems hard to care about. And yeah, sure, Gigan doesn't actually care about it either. That movie isn't really trying to prove a point. It just wants to be a fun thing 70s kids can spend their parents' money on. But Godzilla cares. That particular movie may be nothing more than lighthearted entertainment, but is it wrong? The movie just before Gigan, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, says very nearly the exact same thing, and that movie was deadly serious. The whole film is engineered to scare and disorient you. It's a weird counterculture acid trip nightmare, but that nightmare is absolutely about something. The main theme Monster Zero pivots around isn't really that the Exilians want Earth for the water. It's not about pollution. It's about love overcoming an oppressive technocracy. But you better well damn believe that Godzilla as a whole considers it significant that this dying, oppressive society no longer has access to the kind of natural resources we take for granted. And see, that's the thing. This is what gets me about Godzilla, and if you're still here, I'll just tell you. I'll just fucking tell you. I'll just tell you the secret. The one secret that you need to know to understand Godzilla. Godzilla always means it. Because that line in Gigan about how they need another polluted garbage planet to live on, it's just true. We've turned our world into a garbage planet, and just like the planet at M Space Hunter Nebula, we're soon going to go extinct and leave Earth to the cockroaches and rats and crows and all the other animals that will adapt to the conditions we've created. That's life. That's reality. The movie is a story about fictional aliens and monster battles, but right in the middle of that, this movie, this goofy, weird little sci-fi monster movie for kids, takes just a little bit of time out of its day to go full Godzilla movie on us and say directly to the audience, we are turning our planet into an environment where humans die and cockroaches thrive. At that point, it doesn't matter what the tone of the movie is, or what Godzilla tricks it uses to convey them, or how much of the film is based around that idea. Godzilla is approaching 70 years old. There are 33 fucking movies. That he's taken a few of those off to fight space monsters is immaterial. This moment in Gigan, along with many similar moments from other movies, that's the secret. That's how you can tell the difference between a real Godzilla movie and an imitation. The good shit, the hyper-engineered masterpieces that define the high points of the series, the original, Biollante, Shin, etc. When these movies do stuff like this, it's not important. It isn't really noteworthy when a well-written, serious Godzilla film delivers a serious theme in a well-written way. This is what those movies are designed to do, and that they do it well just means that Toho hired the right people for the job. The way you can tell, the trick is, when you're watching a movie like Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, the first one from '74, which isn't about fucking anything, where the only conflict is evil aliens invade and Godzilla fights a robot, and that's the whole movie. And they bother to script in a sequence where an old Okinawan man curses the mainland because of the long history of war and bloodshed from a fucking real-life Okinawan history in a fucking children's movie about giant robots. In any other series, it would be a weird, out-of-place tonal shift that doesn't belong. But for Godzilla, it's par for the course. It's normal. It's expected. It's what Godzilla is.
Who cares about this stupid election?
Hollywood doesn't understand Godzilla, and since -1 showed up, a lot of people are waking up to that. And so, of course, like Shin before it, people are calling it the best Godzilla movie. Godzilla -1 is a fantastic movie. I've spent hours here praising it, pulling apart all of its strength, how it tackles the very heavy subjects in both familiar and new ways, and how it breaks new grounds and sets the bar high for what we should expect a Reiwa-era Godzilla film to be. Just as the original and Biollante did before with their respective eras. I don't really have any major criticisms. I mean, I don't think it's flawless. I don't particularly like the way they've returned to live action, but it's all CG now. I mean, I understand it, since Takashi Yamazaki is a CGI guy, after all, but the last 3 movies were fully animated, and the Hollywood stuff is all CG, so of course it is, like, you know, God forbid I expect a Japanese live-action Godzilla movie to have a little bit of tokusatsu in it, but, you know, the CGI isn't, like, bad or anything. Most of it is fine, so this doesn't really hurt my opinion of the film. But best? Out of all 33 motherfucking movies? That's a pretty tall order. And not just because of the scope of what you're talking about here, but also because the one to beat is Biollante, which, as I've established, is mankind's greatest work. If you're going to dethrone the thing that makes the Iliad and the collective works of Da Vinci look like first drafts, you need to come out fucking swinging. And to its credit, It does. -1 puts up a damn good fight, but it's just not as good as Biollante. The history of the best Godzilla is a little complicated now, but as a quick refresher, overwhelming dogma for decades was that the original was the best and the sequels were all dumb, goofy trash. This was a general audience opinion. People who knew Godzilla knew better, but the agreement was pretty solid, at least in that regard, and because of that, even the other heavy hitters in the series lived in this kind of assumed status of second best. Mind you, opinions are opinions, and plenty of people out there have always had various picks as their favorite. Maybe not the best, but at least their favorite. And so among fan circles over time, there formed a sort of general consensus tier list. Godzilla's Revenge was always at the bottom. When it was new, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, the 93 one, or Mechagodzilla 2 or whatever, was heaped on as the best of the Versus series, which is the first instance I can remember of new movie is the best movie in my lifetime. And of course, Mothra vs. Godzilla has always been more or less the quintessential Godzilla sequel. And then there's Biollante, which had a bit of a The Thing type situation going on. I knew it, from the first time I saw it, that it was something special. And a lot of other people did too. Some people didn't seem to get it. Some still don't, but fan dogma being what it is, and the fact that at the time I was a child who was still just figuring stuff out, nobody really said the quiet part out loud. That was until 2014 and the national poll. Obviously, when I say national, the nation I'm talking about is Japan. As in 2014, an election was held that was open to the entire Japanese public to vote on the best Godzilla film. This was 10 years after the last Godzilla movie, and it was actually before the Hollywood movie from that year. Not that it would have been included anyway, but that means a couple of things. One, every single one of the 28 films in the voting pool had at least 10 years to sit in the public consciousness to be fully considered by all voters as both a film, period, and a Godzilla film. 2, there was no current zeitgeist regarding a new Godzilla film. It was all focused on the past, which also meant that 3, everyone who voted in the poll would have been someone who, on some level, wanted to share a sincere opinion about the Godzilla series because of the opportunity, so that even if they weren't a hardcore fan or anything like that, everyone who voted cared at least on some level about their vote, and all opinions were, to some degree, considered. The 4 finalists were the original, surprising no one, followed by Mothra vs. Godzilla, which we all know is the quintessential Godzilla sequel, Godzilla vs. Destroya, the full-on exploitation movie where they killed off Godzilla to make people cry and it 100% worked, and as we know today, the first placed winner of that poll, Godzilla vs. Biollante, mankind's greatest work. At that point, the barrier was completely shattered, dogma was rewritten, and people could finally admit out loud what we all secretly knew for a long time. The Biollante was something truly special. There is, still to this day, no other film quite like it, and I seriously can't spend any more time here talking about it, so just watch it if you haven't. The film can speak for itself. I don't have to do any of that work for it. You just need to see it. It's just perfect. Now, another poll was held 2 years later, this time after Shin Godzilla's release. Not only did Shin Godzilla shoot to the top of the list, but Biollante didn't even make the top 5. Why? Well, see my earlier numbered list. It was brand new, it completely consumed the zeitgeist, and people were most certainly voting for Shin just because it was new and they liked it, and it may very well have been the only Godzilla movie they'd actually seen, as much more of the general public were caught up in Shin Godzilla fever than the initial voting pool of the first election. The same is true in the West, where the sentiment was vomited uncritically over and over. And yeah, again, Shin Godzilla is a fucking fantastic movie, but the best ever? Shin has some actual issues that really bother me. Primarily the completely unearned tonal shift in the third act, where we're all just supposed to pretend that we're back in the 60s and Honda's optimism is a totally normal thing to pivot to in a fucking 311 movie that exists in a time where Godzilla vs. Biollante had already happened. Yeah, sure, buddy, whatever. Then we had, of course, the anime trilogy, much maligned by the Monster Fight bros because there's not enough pile drivers or whatever the fuck those chuds think, despite the fact that the last one was the fucking Planet Eater, mankind's second greatest work, and this one pisses me off because it got buried by the apathy. I know. I titled the last section that, and I barely title dropped it, but you have to know by now, but that's what I've been talking about this whole time. The fact that people don't actually give a shit. Because that's what this whole thing is about. Because as happy as I am that Toho finally gave a Godzilla movie a fair shot, as happy as I am that people, even the mythical general audiences, actually got it, that people are into it, they love it, and it's making them wake up from Hollywood's bullshit. As awesome and as sick nasty and cash money as all that stuff is. When I look at these trailers for Godzilla X Kong, fucking embarrassing itself like a goof-ass clown on the world stage, and people talking about how they don't care and it's still awesome, and the way that -1 is the best Godzilla movie, but Planet Eater? A movie that -1 could not exist without, which goes infinitely harder than Minus, that actually beats Biollante in sheer nihilism. The movie where an outer god forces people to watch their own deaths, where blind faith creates monsters that destroy planets, where suicide is treated seriously as an actual topic and not a boogeyman or scapegoat by people who refuse to listen, where black holes send down glowing yellow rose stems to devour the fruit bared by civilization, which is the only reason the universe even exists, that the whole point of existence is to be destroyed, the movie that challenges its own thesis with the most childish, simplistic view of winning and losing that's so genuinely innocent it completely rephrases the entire nature of the Godzilla series. And of all the anxieties of postmodern life, even if for an instant the movie where Mothra appears in a dream of the bombing of Hiroshima as a literal embodiment of love and successfully defeats suicidal ideation, the same movie that, after it's already done that, turns around and denies itself that victory and says maybe some people can't be saved and actually vouches for... Guys, listen to me. Listen to what I'm saying here. The Godzilla movie that literally conquers suicide with love and then still lets suicide be an option for people in dire circumstances. The movie that fucking finally said the thing all Godzilla movies have been dancing around for over 60 years, that the actual source of the problem is civilization itself, and the only real solution is to tear the whole thing down. That's the boring one. If you don't understand Planet Eater, if you look at that movie and all you have to say is, ugh, I'm bored, where's my monster fights? Then fuck off. This is the kind of shit that I think about when people say -1 is the best Godzilla movie. Because it's got human interpersonal drama in it. And that's the only fucking thing that matters, I guess. This is how it's possible for people to be so wrong. They don't get it. They don't understand what Godzilla is, how it works. They watch Gigan and all they see is a Saturday morning Kyodai Hero show with too much stock footage. And who am I? Who the fuck am I that I know any better? Who cares? No, really. Who cares? Do you? Do you actually care about any of us? What is Godzilla to you? A product? A movie? A hot sauce? A toy? What does it matter to you if my opinion is so radically different? What's your stake in it? Why do you care? What should it matter to you that there's more going on than Planet Eater than you're aware of. Do you even want to know? Do you want to understand? I think Godzilla Minus One is probably the third best Godzilla movie, behind Biollante and Planet Eater, but before Hedorah, 54, Tokiwa, and Shin, in that order. But this is exactly my point. You can tell, it should be obvious, the way that I'm talking about Godzilla right now, these movies, these ideas, the way all of these different people have written about all this. To me, Godzilla means something. It's not just a series of movies or a bunch of licensed tie-in products. Godzilla isn't just monster fights or being nerdy about the lore or collecting toys. It's not just hot sauce and video games. All of those things, they're fine. Whatever. And as I've said multiple times, I do extract a good deal of enjoyment from the MonsterVerse films, specifically because of their hilarious awfulness. But Godzilla predates my earliest memories. He's been a core part of my being before I was even aware that I was aware. My fears are a result of the social commentary woven into these films. My outlook for humanity is so grim because the things I see in Godzilla movies keep fucking happening all around me. And it's maddening to sit here, seeing this monster say all the same stuff and see it, and have people look at this thing and just go, "My monster fights." Well, for 2 movies in a row now, Godzilla movies have been directly depicting events that I've experienced in my real life. Love defeating suicide, derealization, the way Koichi's hands shake so badly he uses the ability to do anything with them. Art is more than just products. There is art in products, but the art is bigger than the thing being sold. It's an idea. It's not glued to what you're paying for. As humans, we can attach meaning to anything, and some people do that with movies, where ordinary people in non-speculative fiction settings engage with ordinary things in ordinary ways, but I never did that. I just think that's boring. I latched on to the version that had monsters in it, you know? Fuck me, I guess. I was a kid, I didn't know. But that's how things happened. It's more interesting to me, more powerful, that you can say the exact same sentence, not a metaphor, the exact same sentiment, and communicate an idea with a gorgeous-looking piece of art like monster design and cinematography to capture the essence of an idea in a creative way and still have that thing literally be observable in the world around you. So that's who I am. Godzilla to me is no mere product. Sure, he is. Godzilla is a corporate trademark owned by Japan's largest movie studio, but he's a hell of a lot more than that. And the Iliad is a hell of a lot more than just a goddamn book. What is he to me, exactly? I don't know. How is it that so many people independently create a series with a completely consistent point of view, despite it being composed of films, which are an inherently collaborative art form, made over the course of 70 years? I don't know. I don't have answers to that. All I know is that when I hear Godzilla speak, it means something to me. I'm not the only one who can understand what he's trying to say, because these movies have never been subtle, and these writers are very clear about their intentions. Guess what? Godzilla Minus One is a movie about how war sucks and the bomb is bad. I need 0 cave fumes to speak for Godzilla there, and you didn't need me to, Anwaios. Like Noriko at the end of Minus One, or the nebulous fate of the third version of Goramaki and Shin, on some level, I am Godzilla. And maybe, if you've watched through this whole fucking thing, on some level, maybe you are too. After all, there's a little Godzilla inside all of us. And all of us are, like Godzilla, products of the Crawfordian age. I am not, and have never been, a religious person. That whole fad passed me by. But I'm not immune to certain types of spirituality. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't believe in woo-woo at face value, but I know that watching living dinosaurs in trees or at a park makes me feel a way that I can't really describe. I know that I have weird ideas about me and Godzilla, a fictional character who isn't even a single idea, sharing some kind of metaphorical heartbeat. And some really hard times, because of the trauma I've been through, I've wondered if I'm dead, and if I'm in hell, how long I've been there, and how would I even tell the difference? All without me ever needing to believe that hell is even a real thing, or that it's possible to think after you're dead. And you know what? Sometimes I think Gigan actually did mean what it said. I think maybe on some level Shinichi Sekizawa was affected by the previous Godzilla movie and felt like we were leaving behind a planet only cockroaches would enjoy. I can't prove that, but it feels right. Godzilla Minus One is an excellent, nearly perfect Godzilla movie, and it's not hard to see why people would think it's the best. But if you think that, you, listening right now, I want you to ask yourself the same kind of questions you'd ask someone like me out of incredulity. Who the hell am I saying I am part Godzilla or that I'm in any way qualified to speak for him? Does it really matter to you at all? Is it just a movie? And if not, what else is it? And why? Of course you know war is bad and the bomb is bad and all that, but do you care? Maybe you don't care about Godzilla, and that's fine. Don't worry. I care enough for the whole world. There's no deficit from your apathy. But at the very least, if Minus One means anything to you, if it's broken through the barriers and somehow implanted any unit of meaning into your head or heart at all, if it's gotten into you in a way Planet Eater couldn't, just, if you care, can you do me one little favor? Just ask yourself this. How long have you been living in such an age? Maybe it started when man first stepped out of the Garden of Eden. Please, think about that one last time. Look at my coin. I don't have a graphic. I don't have a graphic for the coin collection thing, but trust me, I got a lot of coins in it. Man, flabbergasted. Oh shit. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I didn't see you there. Flabbergast was just about to leave. No, it wasn't. Yes, you were. No, it wasn't. Flabbergast, you're the worst. You belong in a 27 video game review. You need to leave. It's time for a secret segment. You gotta go. Well, maybe I'll summon my friends like Dark Mally from the reverse mirror dimension. Flabbergast, don't you fucking dare. And then I'll force you to review a game that you really hate, and you have to do it even though you hate it so much, and you really do have to do it for some reason, and you complain about it the whole time, but it's like a review, so that makes sense. Yeah, you're right, that does make sense, Flabbergast. Now that I see it your way, you make a lot of sense. Okay, can you leave now, please? Sheesh. What a dumb, terrible premise for a character. Anyways, okay, so you remember when I said, good grief, this video killed me. This video is killing me. You remember when I said in the December Ween Oops All Secret segment thing, I went on that tangent about like what the hell secret segment's even for? Yeah, so if you're thinking like, hey man, this video doesn't need this 2.5 hour video doesn't need a secret segment at the end of it. No, it does. It definitely needs a secret segment at the end of it. And if you think it doesn't, then found you. You're the one who skipped a secret segment. See, I have my ways of telling. Anyway, so on this episode of Secret Segment, I was thinking, because keep in mind now that I've been writing this since Minus One first came out in the US in like late November. I think it was like the 29th of November or something like that. And so I was writing it, and as I was writing it, since it was relatively, you know what? Let me turn my model, because this is just going to bother me if I don't. There we go. It occurred to me that there might be people who have you heard of this? Have you seen this? Have you heard of spoilers? So spoilers are these things where people who haven't seen a movie or a video game or something yet, and they don't want to know what happens in it because they'll be quote unquote spoiled, which is how it got its name. Now, if you're thinking, what? Like, what do you mean spoiled? How do you spoil a fucking movie? What the fuck are you talking about? Then I have the same question for you. How do you have the answer? I don't know. I don't get it. And it's crazy because people say it all the time, and it's like I remember I saw one time, like, there was some post on the internet. I don't remember where it was. Maybe like a video or something on Reddit or something like that, where it was someone like, hey, I know how to really troll and piss people off. Arm yourself with a bunch of spoilers to like new hip cool monoculture movies and tell them to people, and they'll be so mad that they know something that happens in a movie they haven't seen. Fucking unhinged insanity. So I was gonna do a secret segment about that, because it's insane to me, and it's never made any sense, and because it doesn't make sense. So I want to talk about it and how crazy it is. So I have a very short list here about the three things. Is the mouth not moving because of some? I'm not fixing it. What do you care? This doesn't matter. What? I'm not Fillion. What am I going to do? A backflip? Nobody cares. This is nonsense. Okay, so I made a short list of like three things that basically sum up. I think will be launched to cover all of the things that are so insane to me about like this concept, like spoiler culture. And so I have them here. Where did it go? Oh no, I can't find it. Oh, here it is. Okay, so as you can see, number one with a bullet is why. Because it doesn't make any sense. So the whole idea is that the thing that you haven't seen will be spoiled. And my understanding of why people think this is that if you know what's going to happen, then it won't be good. And I don't understand why that should be. So I think the only way to interpret this logically is that the people who are in spoiler culture believe that knowing a piece, like a singular piece of narrative, like dry, raw narrative information, serves as an actual replacement for the thing, right? And so, for people who aren't insane, that what you're comparing here is a single person telling you a plot detail in a matter-of-fact way versus an actual piece of art that people have made and has like stuff in it, like things. You know what I mean? So like, let's say a movie, right? So a movie, what goes into a movie? You've got someone had to write it, so there's writing involved. So you got your literature aspect because you have people saying stuff, and you also have pacing, which is done by the writer and the editor and the director, and the director is also involved with the actors. So you've got these actors involved in their performances plus the writer, and then like together that brings out a new dimension because you've got like, you know, it's one thing just for one person to write down what they want, and then it's on top of that you have a completely different person bringing their own perspective to it on how to bring those words to life when they decide to inhabit a character. So like, you know, how do you say it and that kind of thing. And then on top of that you have another level, which is the director, and the director's like, hey, you know, maybe you should do it like this, because you know the actor, they may know the bigger picture, you know, to a degree, or they may know all of it, who knows. But the director is the one like steering the ship, as it were. So they're trying to achieve like a kind of like cohesive unity to the whole thing. Like they're trying to get everyone on the same track, essentially, right? Like if you try to boil down what a director does. So they're trying to guide all this stuff together at the same time, and then there's all this other stuff. Like you got to worry about sets. There's the music too. Movies have score and stuff, and so like there's all of these different things working in tandem, made by all of these different people. And what people in this spoiler culture are saying is that all of these things that all of these different people are doing and working together in tandem to create this whole piece, right, can be exactly replicated perfectly because some guy on the internet told you a thing that happens. So that's like, and I know that sounds insane, but listen, there's no other way to make sense of this. That has to be what these people actually believe. That's it. That's the only way that it makes any sense, right? And then it doesn't make sense because how could it? So I don't know. The other thing is it's like, so the big question is, do they only consume media once ever? And I think that's actually an open question, because I've tried to think about it, and it's like, my initial reaction is no, that's stupid. That's not a thing, because you know, if it's just like something that they see once and then they throw it away, okay, whatever. But no, it's not that, because I see people like in hardcore, like established franchise fandoms and stuff, also part of the spoiler culture. So there will be like people who are really into like Star Wars or something, and they'll like talk about Star Wars and like, oh, I don't want any spoilers. Like, so what? You're gonna watch Star Wars one time ever? You're like a Star Wars super fan and you're only going to see the new movie one time. That's it. That's it for you? You're a super fan, but you buy the DVD and you watch it once and then you crack it in half and throw it in the fucking garbage? Like, what the fuck are you talking about? What? Like, what's the reasoning here? You know what I mean? Like, so if knowing what's going to happen beforehand ruins it, then after they've seen the movie, then they know what happened. So then they can never watch it again. They'll never be able to enjoy it anymore. Once they know, they can't watch it. right? And like, you know, I'm trying to think of like any example of anything that I could like try and make sense out of that. Like how is there really media that's actually meant to be consumed a grand total of one time and then thrown away forever? And I couldn't, other than stuff that's like nobody cares about, it's bad, whatever, who cares? But like that's a subjective thing, right? Because like what people care, you can't predict that kind of thing. So the closest thing I could ever come up with were like M. Night Shyamalan movies, where he goes, what a twist, and then that's the whole reason the movie exists. But like even then, so I saw The Sixth Sense. I think it was no, I saw Lady in the Water too, but it was the only one of those M. Night so I've seen 2 M. Night Shyamalan movies. Great, so I've seen 2. And I only saw one of the ones that was just like, it has a twist, and that's the whole reason the movie exists. And so I saw it once, already knowing what the twist was, and it didn't, spoil the movie for me or anything. But it was fun because I had to watch it twice, because what made it so cool was the way that it's, because the premise of the movie is that Bruce Willis is dead the whole time. So, and because the kid talks to ghosts, they see dead people and all that shit. So, but like, how do you have a movie where the main character is a fucking ghost that no other character interacts with, right? Like, that sounds crazy. How do you do that? And so you watch it and you're like, the first time through, even though I knew what happened, like the first time through that I watched it, I was, I just like watched the movie and didn't really pay super close attention to it. And then the second time I went back and I was like, I really wanted to know how the fuck they pulled that off. So like I was paying extra close attention to what exactly the character was doing and stuff like that, because that's a really interesting idea to me. How do you hide something from the viewer the first time through, right? That, like, something that obvious, like that's wild. So that's what made that movie interesting to me, and because that was so interesting, it made seeing it more than once rewarding. And so I'm not really like a big fan of M. Night Shyamalan. I don't think anyone is anymore. But like, I mean, I wasn't really even at the time. I just thought, I thought it was a cool idea behind the movie, so I wanted to see it, and I wanted to see how they pulled it off. So I watched it a couple times, and I got something out of that. So like, I don't know. If M. Night Shyamalan, which is like the most it's just the twist thing ever, if that isn't disposable, what the hell is actually disposable? What is it that is meant to be watched one time, and then you find out what happens, and then you throw it away forever? What the fuck movie is that? I've never heard of a movie like that, or a video game, or anything. What is the thing that you do once and you never do it again? What is that? Who makes it? What artist intentionally makes something that people will never want to see? You know what I mean? Like, who the fuck? I don't know. So the whole concept doesn't even make sense, right? For one, because you can't replicate it, and for two, because art isn't disposable like that. Like, you could probably be perfectly happy seeing, like, there are plenty of things that I could only see once and then I'm done with it forever. You know what I mean? But that doesn't mean that, like, there isn't somebody else out there who wouldn't watch it multiple times. You know what I mean? Okay, whatever. We gotta keep going. Okay. So number 2, what counts? And this really bothers me, because you would think, when I first heard about spoiler culture, my understanding is that it was what happened at the end. The ending and then, or specifically the twist ending is what I initially thought it was, and then come to find out that there's people who think that all endings are spoilers, even if it's like you defeat the bad guy and rescue the princess. Like, okay, sure, yeah, no, yeah, that makes sense. You didn't know that going into it, so now that you know it, you can't ever watch the movie because now it's spoiled, right? Sure. No, that's very logical of you. So, but no, it's bigger than that. But I don't know how big it is, because we're talking about, like, it could be anything, is what I found out, and I don't know where the line is. I don't know what details people will call spoilers. And by the way, I'm not ever going to, like, fold to spoiler culture. It's fucking stupid. I don't care. And if you want to avoid spoilers, don't listen to me talk about media, because I don't. This isn't a real thing, buddy. This ain't a thing. You're just weird. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not gonna protect you from information. I'm not gonna do that. If you don't want to know things, and you watch a video me talk about something, you're gonna end up hearing some stuff. I'm gonna end up talking about the thing. Don't listen to it. If you don't want to know about a thing, don't listen to a thing where I tell you about a thing. I don't know what else to tell you. All right, this. If I make like a video on, like I did on in Shin Ultraman, or like this one on -1, that was the whole thing, right? Because I was thinking, like, oh yeah, I'm talking about what happens in the movie. Wouldn't it be funny? Because, you know, I started writing it pretty soon after it released in the West, and I was like, wouldn't it be funny if people were like, oh well, now I know what happens in the movie, now I can't see it, like, so, you know, whatever. But it is hard to tell, because there is some stuff that's, like, not the ending, but there's still, like, you know, like little bits of lore or twists and turns, or like betrayals, or other things, and it's hard to know, because some of that stuff can get down to, like, you know, the initial incident. You know what I mean? Like, if the premise is the premise of the movie, and like, I keep saying movie, by the way, as shorthand. I really don't play a lot of video games, so, like, for me, when I hear this, it's about movies generally. But if you hear me say movies while talking about spoiler culture, you can also add in video games or what other kind of media that people complain about this too. But, like, what was I saying? So like I don't know is the thing. So let's say, for instance, you know, they're making new Dune movies now, and then it sounds like they're going to make a third one. And you know, the thing that pisses me off about Dune is that they made the first movie, and that was really cool, and then they made the sci-fi adaptation of the first 3 books, which is less cool, but at least they did the first 3. But then they stopped. And if you don't know about Dune, the 4th book is the one that's, like, that matters and is good. That's the, you know, the one with the God Emperor worm. So that's all I want to see. You know, I like the first movie, but, like, you know, get to the fucking 4th book already. Just skip all this other shit. Nobody cares about this other crap. Just get to the one where the dude fuses with a giant worm. That's what we want to see, right? So there's 2 movies now, and I think 2 of them are doing the first book, and then it sounds like the 3rd one is going to do the 2nd or 3rd book or something. I don't know. But so if they keep making these, they eventually do get to the 4th book, is it a spoiler for the movie to know? Like, okay, so in the sci-fi version of the 3rd book, it ends with, and I haven't read. I started reading the first one, and I got, like, halfway in the blah blah blah. But it's not important. But so, like, in the adaptation of the 3rd one, it ends with the setup for God Emperor, you know, because he starts fusing with the, what are they called, the sand trout or something like that. And so is that a spoiler for the third movie? No? If the movie ends like if that's part of the book and that gets adapted when the new movies adapt the third book, is it a spoiler to say like Leto the Second fuses with a worm? But then that's the premise of the fourth book. Like that's the whole fourth book. So if it's a spoiler for the ending of the third book, but it's not a spoiler for the fourth book because it's the basic premise, like where is the line? Do you know what I'm saying? Then Scott Aukerman had a really funny bit about this in some of the CBB episodes where he would talk about spoilers, and he would say stuff like even just knowing the title is a spoiler, which reads to me as an exaggeration because it's like a funny joke, but also at the same time. So I have a friend who is like part of spoiler culture, and it's so frustrating to talk to them about anything because like she will say, hey, you should check this thing out. And I go, what is that? And she says, it's cool. You should check it out. And I go, okay, what is it? She goes, just watch it. It's cool. You'll like it. Which is like, I'm sorry, but I'm going to need a little bit more information. And so that's kind of the crux of it for me. And so like there's a good example of it now because the new Alien movie is going to come around pretty soon. And so the trailer came out, and the trailer doesn't tell you shit about what happens in that movie. All that you see in the trailer is every shots from Alien and Aliens. And like, yeah, I know they're not literally from those first two movies, but also fucking yes they are. It's just, it is literally just the first two movies copy pasted again. Like they built sets from the first two movies, and then they got the weapons from the second one, and they put actors in Halloween costumes to replicate that. And it's so like trashy and stupid and obviously pandering, and it's completely without any substance whatsoever. It is so, and people are like, oh, look, Alien's good again because it's like a movie I've already seen. And it drives me up the fucking wall because I'm like, but you seen it all. You have the movie. Just watch the movie you already have. Why are you like this? This is supposed to be a new movie, not the same one. Am I taking crazy pills? What the fuck is going on here? New movies should be new. They should have new things in them. Why is that a controversial opinion, right? So, I was not excited at all about the new Alien movie. I was like, okay, well, so at least Ridley Scott's not directing it, right? So there's not going to be any creationist propaganda in it. So that's good, I guess. But like, it's going to be boring, and there's not going to be anything new in it, and it's just going to be a rehash of other movies I've already seen. So like, why? I'm not excited about this. I don't care about this. I can just watch Alien already. I can just watch it. That's fine. It's a movie that I've already seen. And so I had to go look for spoilers in order to care. And now I care, because now I found some spoilers, and now it's interesting. Big Chap is back, sort of. And they reverse engineer him, and they get the black goo, and then they make new aliens. So it's not XX121 again, even though the aliens they show in the trailer do look exactly like that species, but you know, whatever. It's not, supposedly. And So they're gonna be different. Maybe their life cycle's a little different. And there's a new one too, like a botched lab project or something that's like a new version of the newborn or something like that. So it's going to be like essentially a Dark Horse comic sort of thing. So that's kind of interesting. There's some interesting things. I don't really think it's that cool. If there was something, the thing that really gets me excited about alien movies isn't slightly different versions of a species of alien I've already seen. That's not exciting. Like the black goo was cool. I really like the hammerpedes. The neomorphs were cool. The baby head they need to bring back, that shit is awesome. That needs to be in a movie. Or like any other kind of like weird biomechanical Giger-esque nightmare stuff. That kind of stuff is cool, right? But like, I don't know. I can't get excited for the bare minimum. But, hey, it's something, right? But like the whole point, that was a huge tangent. The whole point I was trying to get at is that I had to, because they weren't marketing any of the stuff that would sell the movie, they put out the trailer and it didn't sell the movie. It sold other movies that already existed. It didn't sell this one. And give me a reason to go see the new movie. It just gave me a reason to watch the movies I already had. So that's a fucking piss poor marketing strategy. That's not working. And the thing is, I saw like there were YouTube videos that I was looking up to get some of these things, and even they were like, and you fucking know how alien YouTubers are. I'm not gonna get into it, but even they were like, yeah, so we kind of need spoilers. I kind of need to talk about them because like, Ridley Scott shit the bed so hard, and like people don't know anything because they're not telling anyone, so you have all of the reason in the world to worry and no reason in the world to be excited, and which is right. That's exactly the case. That's exactly where I am. That's my thoughts. So, and this last thing, we're up at like 30 minutes now, but this last thing, how long? So how long do you have to wait? So I was thinking, of course, well, now not only has -1 been out for what is math? How does math work? 5 months, something like that? Almost 6 months at this point. And so like surely at that point there aren't going to be there won't be anyone like complaining or whatever, right? Because like I was only thinking about it because it was so new at the time, and the thought crossed my head is like, hey, I wonder if any of those spoiler culture weirdos are going to care about this. And then after, I was like, well, no, because it's going to take so long. But actually, I don't know, because there are people who put like really long expiration dates on spoilers. And like, I've even met people who were like, don't spoil it ever. Well, when I say meet, I don't mean like, I shouldn't have said meet. I mean like I've seen the sentiments. Like when I read comments and stuff or about from people who are in the spoiler culture, I see them say this, and that's not often. Normally, like they'll say, oh well, so and so months. They never agree on how many months it is. They never agree on the amount of time, but a lot of them do think that there is an expiration date. Most of them, I believe. But like then there's some that's just like, if I haven't seen it, it's a spoiler, and I expect everyone to never say anything about any media ever in my presence because I haven't seen it, and I expect them to know that I haven't seen it. Which is, out of all of this shit, that takes the cake for me. The one where like you expect people to like bend to your complete insanity, and then just like like, expect them to know what you have and haven't seen, what you have and haven't played, and, like, they gotta watch the way they talk around you. Like, that's a bridge too far for me. Like, it's one thing if I'm talking, and I gotta say, as much as this shit makes no fucking sense to me and is stupid and as crazy as I think it is, honestly, if we're having a conversation and you're like, hey, I don't really want to know what happens in this thing, could you not tell me if I start talking about a thing? That's a super easy request for me to meet. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I can do that. I can simply not tell you what happens, right? If it's really that important to you and you ask, then yes, I can simply not tell you. It's not a difficult request for me. It's and I'm being over the top because this is a secret segment, and it is ridiculous to me, but at the same time, it's 2.5 hour long video about some pretty heavy stuff, and it's pretty personal and emotional and at points, and we get a little silly making fun of spoilers. We play it pretty fast and loose here. We have fun. This is a secret segment. We don't care. But, like, if you expect me to change my behavior based on shit that I don't know, that isn't something that anyone should ever know to do as a default, that's too much. And, like, you can't get mad at me if you don't tell me, right? Because this is not a sensible thing. This is not something that anyone should ever expect to meet. So, like, if you're a part of this spoiler culture thing, the burden is in fact on you. You do have to make it known that you don't want to know things, or else people are liable to tell you things. And the older the media in question is, the more of a case this is. So the longer it is, the more you have to be on your game. The more you have to go, I don't want to know. And that sounds like a weird way to live your life to me, but whatever. If you're on top of it and you are around people that are willing to accommodate some pretty simple and easy to do things, then fine, live your life. But when it becomes, I am just going to make these assumptions and obviously this, and, like, be indignant about it and be like, oh well, fucking, there is no limit on spoilers and everything's a spoiler, and don't even tell me the title because even that's giving too much away, then you're fucking, fucking no, I'm not gonna do that. That's ridiculous. Anyways, so yeah, I don't know. I've run out of things to complain about this. I mean, it's just so crazy to me. It just doesn't make any sense. But, like, what can I say? It's who wants to watch more than 40 minutes of me saying, wow, this thing doesn't make any sense. So I think we're done here. I think we can move on. And no, there's not going to be a super secret segment, which isn't even real. There is no such thing as super secret segment. So anyone who hallucinated the super secret segment on any other videos of mine, should see a doctor, because that just doesn't exist. And, is super secret segment in the room with you right now? No, I don't think so. It's not real. So, yeah, that's it. And until next time, I don't have a sign off for secret segment.